Right before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my sister sneered over the phone. "Do not wait for Dad. He chose to stand with me today." I whispered into the receiver, asking how she could possibly do this on my wedding day. She just laughed. "You should have known your place. I thought I would be walking into my reception completely humiliated and alone." Until the double doors swung open. My sister froze her eyes wide with absolute terror. My dad could not even look up from the floor. He finally realized who really owned his life. My name is Juliet, and at 33 years old, I had spent my entire life being the background character in my own family. As the founder and CEO of Vanguard Holdings, an elite property investment firm, I had built an empire in total secrecy to protect myself from my parents' constant financial demands. But on the afternoon of my wedding, standing in the bridal suite of a beautiful estate in upstate New York, I realized secrecy was no longer an option. If you have ever had your own flesh and blood try to ruin your biggest milestone, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe, because you will definitely want to hear how I turned my wedding day into their ultimate eviction notice. Growing up, my sister Savannah was the undisputed center of our universe. 3 years older than me, Savannah never had to lift a finger to get exactly what she wanted. My parents, Richard and Patricia, catered to her every whim. When Savannah wanted to study art history in Paris, my parents remortgaged our family home. When I wanted to study finance at a state school, I was told I needed to take out student loans because the family budget was too tight. I learned very early that my role was to be self-sufficient and silent so that all available resources could be funneled directly to my sister. Despite a lifetime of obvious favoritism, I still held on to the foolish hope that my wedding day would be different. I was marrying Ethan, a wonderful man who ran several successful restaurants in the city. We had planned a beautiful evening ceremony surrounded by the people we loved. My parents had been surprisingly agreeable during the planning process. My father had even made a very loud, very public display of offering to pay for the catering and floral arrangements. He brought it up constantly, ensuring everyone in our extended family knew how generous he was being. I genuinely believed they were finally showing up for me. I was standing in front of the full-length mirror in my bridal suite, the heavy silk of my wedding gown draped perfectly around me. My hair and makeup were flawless. The string quartet was already playing softly in the garden below. We were less than an hour away from the ceremony. Then my phone rang. I saw Savannah's name on the caller ID, and a knot formed in my stomach. She had refused to be a bridesmaid, claiming the dress color washed her out, but she had RSVP'd for her and her husband. I answered the call, expecting her to complain about the parking situation or the humidity outside. "Hey, Jules," Savannah said. Her voice was bubbly and light, completely devoid of any remorse. "Listen, minor change of plans for today. Mom and Dad are not going to be able to make it to the ceremony." I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The room around me suddenly felt very cold. I asked her what she was talking about. I asked if there had been a car accident or a medical emergency. "Oh no, everyone is perfectly fine," Savannah laughed. "It is just that today is the Grandparents' Day extravaganza at my country club. Mason and Lily have been looking forward to it for weeks." Mason and Lily were her 5-year-old twins. I gripped the edge of the vanity table. I reminded her that my wedding date had been set for 14 months. I told her the country club event was just a casual afternoon party. "It is not just a party," Savannah snapped, her tone immediately shifting from bubbly to condescending. "Colin's parents are going to be there. They are highly influential in the private school admissions network. We need to present a united family front to secure the twins' spots for next year." Mason and Lily would be absolutely traumatized if their grandparents did not show up to take pictures with them for the society pages. I could not breathe. I asked her if my parents were seriously skipping my wedding to take photographs at a country club. "Do not be so dramatic," Juliet Savannah sighed. "Your wedding is basically just a formality anyway. You and Ethan already live together. It is not like this is some massive life-changing event. You can just send us some pictures later." I demanded to speak to my father. I could hear the muffled sounds of a crowded country club patio in the background. A moment later, my father's voice came on the line. He sounded irritated, as if my phone call was an unwelcome distraction from his afternoon cocktail hour. "Juliet, we do not have time for a tantrum right now," Richard said. I asked him how he could do this. I was his daughter. I was getting married in less than an hour. I begged him to just drive over for the ceremony and skip the reception. "Savannah's in-laws are incredibly influential people, Juliet," my father replied, his voice dripping with frustration. "We need to make a good impression today. It is vital for the twins' future. You have always been so fiercely independent. You never needed our help. Just like when you selfishly moved out at 18 instead of staying home and paying rent to help Savannah when she was struggling with her credit card debt. You abandoned your sister then. We are just making sure we do not abandon her now." The sheer audacity of his words paralyzed me. He was actually using my independence against me. He was punishing me for refusing to be Savannah's personal piggy bank when I was just a teenager. "Walk yourself down the aisle," Juliet, Richard commanded. "You are good at doing things alone." The line went dead. I stood in the center of the bridal suite, staring at the blank screen of my phone. I felt a stinging sensation behind my eyes, the familiar burn of tears that I had sworn I would not shed over them anymore. But before the first tear could even fall, the door to the bridal suite burst open. My wedding planner, a usually unflappable woman named Michelle, rushed into the room. She was pale and out of breath, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Juliet, we have a massive emergency," Michelle gasped. "The catering manager and the head florist just came to find me. They are packing up their trucks. They are threatening to leave right now." I asked her what was going on. I told her my father had already paid them in full last month. Michelle shook her head frantically. "The catering manager just received a notification from his bank. Your father called his bank this morning and initiated a hard stop on the cashier's check. He reported the payment as fraudulent. The funds were completely revoked. The vendors are demanding immediate payment or they are walking out." The final puzzle piece clicked into place. My father had not just abandoned me at the altar to take photos at a country club. He had orchestrated a public display of generosity by handing over that check only to secretly cancel it on the morning of my wedding. He had stolen the money back to fund whatever extravagant networking opportunity Savannah had cooked up for her country club friends. He left me to discover the sabotage an hour before I was supposed to feed 150 guests. He wanted me to be humiliated. He wanted Ethan's family to see me as a pathetic, unsupported failure who could not even afford her own wedding dinner. He wanted to teach me a lesson about knowing my place in the family hierarchy. Michelle was looking at me with pure pity. She reached out, offering me a tissue, fully expecting me to collapse onto the floor in a fit of hysterical tears. She expected the bride to break down, but I did not break down. The scared, eager to please daughter they thought I was had died a long, long time ago. I did not feel sad anymore. I felt an absolute terrifying calm wash over my entire body. I lowered my hand and pushed the tissue away. I walked over to my bridal clutch resting on the velvet armchair. I opened the clasp and reached inside. I pulled out a heavy matte black titanium credit card. It was a corporate card tied directly to Vanguard Holdings, the company my family had no idea I owned. I walked back to Michelle and pressed the heavy metal card into her trembling hand. "Go down to the catering manager and the florist," I said, my voice eerily steady. "Swipe this card for the full outstanding balance. Then I want you to add a 100% gratuity tip to every single vendor who decides to stay and do their job today." Michelle stared at the black card in her hand, her mouth slightly open. She nodded vigorously, spun around, and sprinted out the door to save the reception. I turned back to my vanity table and picked up my phone. I did not call Ethan. I did not call my bridesmaids. I opened my messages and found the contact for Mr. Carmichael. He was my lead corporate attorney, a man known for his absolute ruthlessness in the boardroom. We had spent the last 5 years executing highly sensitive financial maneuvers. I had strict protocols in place for exactly this kind of situation, though I had always prayed I would never actually have to use them against my own blood. With perfectly steady fingers, I typed out a single precise message. "Execute the default protocol. Today." I hit send. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. I adjusted my veil, smoothed the silk of my skirt, and walked out the door. It was time to get married. And then it was time to collect my debts. The heavy oak doors of the chapel swung open. The string quartet shifted seamlessly into the bridal chorus. A collective breath caught in the throats of 150 guests as I stood at the threshold completely alone. I kept my chin high and my shoulders pulled back. Every step I took down that velvet runner was a deliberate statement. I did not look at the floor. I did not shrink. I looked straight ahead at the man waiting for me at the altar. But even with my eyes locked on Ethan, I could feel the gravitational pull of the void in the front row. 5 empty chairs sat grouped together on the bride's side. They were perfectly positioned, decorated with the silk ribbons my mother had insisted on ordering. They were meant for my father, my mother Savannah, her husband Colin, and my grandmother. Those 5 empty seats screamed louder than the music. They were a physical monument to my family prioritizing a toddler's birthday party over my marriage. I felt a ripple of confused whispers wash over the pews. My colleagues from Vanguard Holdings exchanged sharp, knowing glances. They knew my work ethic. They knew my character. Seeing me abandoned by my own blood in real time solidified a silent wall of loyalty among them. Halfway down the aisle, Ethan did not wait for me to finish the walk alone. He broke tradition, stepping down from the altar and striding down the runner to meet me. He offered his arm with a warm, grounding smile. He did not ask where my father was. He already knew the answer by the look in my eyes. Together we walked the rest of the way. The ceremony was beautiful because it was honest. Ethan's family sat in the front row on his side, their faces radiating genuine joy and support. His mother wiped away tears. His father beamed with pride. They were everything a family was supposed to be, standing in stark contrast to the hollow space on my left. I spoke my vows with absolute conviction. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause that erupted from our chosen family shook the chapel walls. I felt a surge of triumph. I had survived the ultimate rejection and emerged entirely whole. The reception was held in the grand ballroom of the estate. The room was bathed in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne. The crisis with the catering manager had been completely resolved thanks to my titanium card, and the food was spectacular. For the first 2 hours, I actually let myself forget about the people who were not there. I danced with my new husband. I laughed with my closest friends. I allowed myself to be celebrated. Then right after the main course was cleared, we sat down at our sweetheart table. I reached into my clutch to reapply my lipstick and saw the screen of my phone light up. It was a text message from my mother. I stared at the glowing notification. Part of me wanted to swipe it away and ignore it until tomorrow. But the cold, calculated part of my brain, the part that built a multi-million-dollar firm from scratch, demanded that I read it. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. It was a photograph. The image showed my father standing on the manicured lawn of Savannah's exclusive country club. He was wearing a tailored beige suit, grinning from ear to ear. Next to him stood Savannah, looking impossibly smug, holding the hands of her 5-year-old twins. Between them, my father and sister were holding up a massive, oversized novelty check. The amount written on the cardboard was $40,000. It was made out to the prestigious Oakwood Preparatory Academy. Beneath the photograph, my mother had typed a message. "Hope you got married okay. Dad just paid for the twins. Private school tuition for the whole year using the family trust. We wanted to make sure they get the best start in life. Family first." I read the text twice. The words blurred together. Family first. They had abandoned me on my wedding day, and my mother had the absolute nerve to send me a picture of them throwing away tens of thousands of dollars to secure Savannah's social status. But it was not just the cruelty of the message that made my blood run ice cold. It was the specific mention of the family trust. Ethan noticed my posture stiffen. He leaned over, his brow furrowed with concern. He asked me what was wrong. He asked if the caterers were acting up again. I did not say a word. I simply handed him the phone. Ethan read the message. He looked at the photograph of the novelty check, then looked back at me. He knew about my parents' favoritism, but he did not know the deep buried financial mechanics of my family. I had kept that secret locked away for 5 long years. He asked how my father could afford a $40,000 novelty check on a whim. He pointed out that Richard was just a middle manager at a logistics firm. I leaned in close to Ethan, keeping my voice low and urgent so the surrounding tables could not hear us over the jazz band. "My father is not a middle manager," I whispered. "He was the owner of that logistics firm. 5 years ago, he made a series of arrogant, reckless investments. He nearly drove the entire company into bankruptcy. He was going to lose the business. He was going to lose the family estate. He was facing total financial ruin." Ethan stared at me, processing the new information. He asked how they managed to keep the house and maintain their lavish country club lifestyle. I gripped the edge of the silk tablecloth. "Because I bailed them out. I had just launched Vanguard Holdings. I was pulling in massive returns, but I kept my wealth entirely hidden from them because I knew Savannah would bleed me dry. When Dad was days away from default, I created an anonymous shell company. I used that shell company to buy his corporate debt. I saved the estate. I saved his firm. I restructured the company and kept him on as a salaried employee to save his pride." Ethan was completely silent, his eyes wide with shock. I did not stop there. I continued, the anger finally breaking through my calm facade. "I set up what they think is a magical family trust that pays out a generous monthly dividend. My father thinks his investments magically rebounded. He thinks he is a financial genius who turned his luck around. He has absolutely no idea that every single dollar he spends, every luxury car he leases, every country club fee he covers for Savannah comes directly from my personal accounts. I am the anonymous investor. I am the family trust." Ethan looked down at the photograph on the phone again. The pieces were snapping together in his mind. He looked at the $40,000 check in the picture. He looked at my father's beaming face. "He just used your money," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He used my money," I confirmed. "He used my money to pay for Savannah's twins to go to a private school." My mind raced back to the phone call from an hour ago. My father had loudly boasted about paying for the country club party setup. He had canceled the check for my wedding caterer because he needed that exact cash flow to cover Savannah's extravagant demands. He had stolen the catering budget and replaced it with money he siphoned out of the trust. He was literally embezzling from my shell company to fund the very event they abandoned my wedding to attend. They did not just choose her over me. They forced me to pay for the privilege of being replaced. A sharp metallic ringing echoed in my ears. The sheer audacity of the betrayal was almost too massive to comprehend. My mother had told me to know my place. My father had told me I was too independent. Savannah had mocked my budget wedding. They had spent my entire life stepping on my neck to elevate Savannah, and they were using my own hidden empire to buy the shoes they wore to do it. I looked at the photograph one last time. Savannah's smug, victorious smile burned itself into my memory. She thought she had won. She thought she had proven once and for all that she was the golden child, and I was just the discarded afterthought. She had no idea that the ground she was standing on was entirely owned by me. I placed the phone face down on the table. I stood up. The heavy silk of my wedding gown rustled against the hardwood floor. The movement caught the attention of my bridesmaids at the adjacent table, but I did not look at them. I looked down at my new husband. Ethan looked up at me. He saw the cold, unforgiving calculation in my eyes. He did not tell me to calm down. He did not tell me to let it go and enjoy our night. He knew me better than that. He stood up right beside me and buttoned his suit jacket. "Change of plans," I said, my voice carrying a lethal edge. "Tell the driver to pull the car around to the front doors." Ethan nodded, a fierce, supportive light in his eyes. "Where are we going?" I reached over and grabbed my bridle clutch, feeling the weight of the titanium card inside. "We are crashing a country club." The drive from the wedding reception to Savannah's sprawling suburban estate took exactly 40 minutes. I sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's car, watching the trees blur past my window. I did not take off my veil. I did not change into a more practical outfit. I remained in my full bridal gown, the heavy silk pooling around my legs, the intricate lace bodice gleaming under the passing streetlights. Ethan drove with a quiet, focused intensity. He held my left hand the entire way, his thumb tracing the new gold band on my finger. He did not ask if I was sure about this. He knew that the time for hesitation had passed. We turned onto the winding, manicured street of Savannah's neighborhood. It was a gated community filled with massive, perfectly uniform mansions with pristine lawns. We pulled up to the wrought iron gates of Savannah's estate. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, valet attendants rushing back and forth in crisp white uniforms. The country club event had transitioned into an extravagant after-party at her home. Huge white tents were pitched on the sprawling front lawn. The warm glow of fairy lights dripped from the ancient oak trees. I could hear the upbeat tempo of a live jazz band spilling out into the night air. Waitstaff in black vests carried silver trays of champagne flutes and delicate appetizers through a crowd of local socialites, wealthy neighbors, and influential private school board members. Ethan parked the car right at the edge of the driveway, completely ignoring the confused valet attendant who rushed forward. Ethan killed the engine and looked over at me. He told me he had my back no matter how ugly this was about to get. I smiled a genuine calm smile and told him that it was already ugly. Now it was just about to get honest. I opened my door and stepped out into the humid evening air. The heavy fabric of my wedding dress swept across the paved driveway. My heels clicked loudly against the stone as I walked directly toward the center of the party. Ethan walked right beside me, tall and unyielding in his tailored wedding suit. It took less than 30 seconds for the party to notice the intrusion. The sight of a fully dressed bride crashing a high-society suburban lawn party was impossible to ignore. A woman holding a martini glass stopped mid-laugh, her eyes widening in absolute shock. The man next to her followed her gaze and froze. Like a row of dominoes falling, the lively chatter began to die down. The silence spread in a wave washing over the manicured lawn. Even the jazz band faltered, the saxophone player missing a note before the music trailed off into an awkward scraping halt. 100 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me. I recognized many of the guests from local society magazines and charity galas. These were the people my parents and my sister desperately wanted to impress. These were the elite gatekeepers of the life they thought they deserved. And right now they were staring at me as if I were an apparition. I did not shrink under their gaze. I kept my head high, my posture perfect, and walked right up to the edge of the main tent. From the far side of the lawn, a figure in a tailored emerald green dress pushed violently through the crowd. It was Savannah. Her face was flushed dark red with fury, completely shattering her carefully cultivated image of the effortless, graceful hostess. She marched toward me, her heels sinking slightly into the pristine grass, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Are you insane?" Savannah hissed as soon as she was close enough. Her voice was pitched low, a frantic attempt to keep the surrounding guests from hearing, but the total silence of the yard made her words carry perfectly. "What are you doing here? You are ruining the aesthetic. You look ridiculous." I looked at her emerald dress, the expensive diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, and the absolute panic burning in her eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a calm, chilling clarity. "I am simply making an appearance at the family gathering, Savannah," I replied. "Since you and our parents could not find the time to attend my wedding, I thought I would bring the wedding to you." Savannah's eyes darted frantically around the yard, taking in the whispering guests and the staring waitstaff. "You always have to make everything about you," she spat, taking a threatening step forward. "This is a crucial networking event for my children. Mason and Lily need to be seen in the right environment. We curated this entire evening to project stability and class, and you show up here in a wedding dress trying to steal my spotlight. Leave right now before I call security." Before I could respond, two more figures pushed their way through the crowd. Richard and Patricia had arrived. My mother was wearing a pale pink cocktail dress, clutching a crystal champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were white. My father looked absolutely furious. His face was thunderous, his chest puffed out in a classic display of aggressive patriarchal dominance. He stepped directly in front of Savannah, physically blocking me from moving any further into the yard. "What is the meaning of this?" Juliet Richard barked, abandoning any attempt at a hushed whisper. He wanted to assert control. He wanted the wealthy neighbors to see him put his rebellious daughter in her place. He pointed a thick finger at my face. "You are socially unfit for a gathering like this. You always have been." I felt Ethan tense beside me, his protective instinct flaring, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm to keep him back. This was my fight. Patricia chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial syrupy concern, designed entirely for the audience watching us. "Oh, Juliet, you are making such a fool of yourself. You have always been so awkward and selfish. We tried to include you in things, but you never knew how to behave. You should have just stayed at your little dinner and stayed out of our way. We had to prioritize the twins today. You are a grown woman acting like a spoiled child." Richard nodded loudly, emboldened by my mother's gaslighting. "Look at you," he sneered, gesturing up and down at my wedding gown. "Crashing a private event because you cannot handle the fact that the world does not revolve around your little property hobby. You are disrupting important people, people who actually contribute to society. Leave this property immediately." The guests were absolutely captivated. Some looked appalled, others looked gleeful at the unfolding drama. My father stood tall, looking around at the crowd as if expecting applause for his firm handling of the situation. He felt powerful. He felt completely untouchable. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. I let everyone in the yard absorb my father's arrogant words. Then I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the sharp, calculated smile of a predator watching its prey walk directly into a trap. "Important people," I repeated softly, letting the words roll off my tongue. "Contributing to society." "That is fascinating, Dad, because I have a very important question for you. A question about how exactly you are contributing to this beautiful society." Richard scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "I do not have to answer to you." I ignored his bluster and took one step closer. I asked him loudly and clearly, so every single guest in the tent could hear me, how he paid for this event. I pointed to the massive white tents, the live jazz band, the imported champagne, and the valet attendants. I asked him how he covered the $50,000 invoice for this party setup. And then I asked him how he managed to pay for the $40,000 tuition check he handed to Savannah at the country club just 3 hours ago. My mother's face went entirely slack. Savannah blinked, her eyes darting between me and my father. Richard did not falter. He was so deeply entrenched in his own lies that he genuinely believed his own fiction. He smirked, his chest puffing out even further. He projected his voice so the private school admissions directors nearby could hear him clearly. "My investments are thriving," Richard declared proudly. "I have built a highly successful, diversified portfolio. The market has been exceptionally kind to my strategies. I am providing for my family because I am a savvy businessman, something you would not understand with your little property hobby." The sheer arrogance of his statement hung in the heavy summer air. He was standing on a lawn. He did not pay for drinking champagne. He could not afford wearing a suit bought with stolen funds. And he was calling my multi-million-dollar corporation a little property hobby. I did not yell. I did not scream. I just tilted my head, looking directly into his smug, lying eyes. My smile sharpened into something dangerous. "Is that what you told them?" I asked. Richard laughed, a harsh, forced sound that echoed off the canvas walls of the party tent. He adjusted his silk tie and looked at the crowd, trying to maintain his image as the benevolent patriarch dealing with a hysterical daughter. "He told me I was making a fool of myself. He said I was letting my emotions ruin a perfectly good evening and that I needed to go home and calm down." I did not move a single inch. I turned to Ethan. He did not need a verbal cue. He unclasped the heavy leather briefcase he had carried from the car and stepped right up to the massive catered buffet table. He pushed aside a silver tray of caviar and a towering crystal champagne fountain to make room. Ethan reached into the briefcase and pulled out 3 thick black leather-bound financial ledgers. He dropped them onto the white linen tablecloth. The heavy thud made the silver platters rattle. The crowd went completely silent again. I stepped up to the table and rested my hand on the top ledger. I told my father that since he loved talking about his thriving investments in front of his friends, we should do some actual math. I told him we should show everyone exactly how savvy he really was. Richard turned pale. The arrogant flush drained from his cheeks in an instant. He lunged forward, ordering me to shut my mouth and respect his privacy, but Ethan smoothly blocked his path. Ethan was a head taller and built like a wall. He just crossed his arms and stared my father down, silently daring him to take another step. Richard froze. I opened the first ledger. My voice was loud, clear, and projected perfectly across the silent yard. I announced that Richard Wilson had not made a single successful stock trade, real estate flip, or corporate investment in exactly 5 years. The crowd gasped. I flipped the page and read the numbers aloud. I listed his devastating losses from a failed commercial real estate venture. I listed the 6-figure deficit from an offshore tech startup he backed without doing any basic research. I looked up at the circle of wealthy neighbors and country club board members. I saw their eyes widening in shock. These were the people Richard had been bragging to for years. They were the people who thought he was a financial genius. I told the crowd that 5 years ago, my father's logistics firm had gone completely bankrupt. He was facing total foreclosure on his home. He had 0 liquid assets left. Richard was shaking his head, stammering, telling the guests not to listen to a disgruntled child. But I was just getting started. I opened the second ledger. I explained that right before the bank came to take his house, a miraculous rescue package arrived. A highly exclusive private family trust was suddenly established. It paid off his corporate debt, covered his mortgage, and began depositing a massive monthly allowance into his personal checking account. I looked right at Savannah, who was clutching a glass of wine with trembling hands. I explained that this trust paid for her country club memberships, her luxury vehicles, and her twins' private school tuition. Richard swallowed hard. He tried to puff out his chest again, claiming the trust was the result of a brilliant hedge fund maneuver he had orchestrated. I smiled. I told the crowd that the family trust was actually a shell account. I told them the shell account was funded entirely by a single corporate entity called Vanguard Holdings. I waited a beat, letting the name hang in the humid night air. Then I looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. I am the sole founder and CEO of Vanguard Holdings. I have been funding your entire life, your fake success, and this very party with my own money. The reaction from the crowd was instant. Whispers broke out like wildfire. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in shock. Private school directors exchanged uncomfortable, calculating looks. The illusion of the great Richard Wilson was shattered into a million pieces right in front of his most important peers. He was not a self-made titan. He was a dependent living off the secret charity of the daughter he had just abandoned at the altar. Patricia could not handle the social humiliation. My mother stepped forward, her face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. She tried to play the victim, falling back on the only tactic she had ever known. She pointed a shaking finger at me and raised her voice, desperate to win back the sympathy of the crowd. "We are your parents!" Patricia cried out, her voice echoing shrilly across the lawn. "We gave you life. We raised you. We provided a roof over your head. You owed us that money for everything we sacrificed for you." Her words were dripping with venom and entitlement. I did not flinch. I looked at my mother and asked her exactly what she had sacrificed. I reminded her that I moved out on my 18th birthday with 2 suitcases and a minimum wage job, because she told me the house was too crowded and Savannah needed my bedroom to use as a walk-in closet. I reminded her that I paid for my own college tuition by working double shifts, while she and my father bought Savannah a brand new sports car for merely passing her sophomore classes. I told Patricia that my money was not a repayment for a loving childhood. My money was a ransom. I paid it silently because I knew if they went bankrupt, they would move into my apartment and drain me dry. I bought my freedom by funding their fake reality. Patricia was practically vibrating with rage. She looked around at her friends, pleading with her eyes, but the other women were suddenly looking everywhere but at her. The social currency they had hoarded for years was evaporating. Patricia insisted that family takes care of family. She claimed that my success was only possible because they had taught me to be independent. She tried to twist their neglect into a parenting strategy. It was a pathetic display of a narcissist losing control of the narrative. I told her that stealing money from my company on the morning of my wedding was not taking care of family. I told her that canceling the check for my caterer just so she could buy influence for Savannah's children was a blatant act of theft. Savannah could not stay quiet any longer. The spotlight was shifting away from her perfect party, and she hated it. She stepped forward, her emerald green dress shimmering under the fairy lights. She wrapped her arm tightly around her husband, Colin. Colin was a tall, conventionally handsome man who always looked like he was posing for a catalog. He also looked incredibly nervous right now. Savannah tossed her hair over her shoulder and laughed. It was a loud, forced, theatrical laugh, meant to show everyone that she was completely unbothered by my revelations. "It does not matter whose money it was originally," Juliet Savannah announced, projecting her voice to ensure the wealthy neighbors could hear her triumph. Dad managed the trust. He was in charge of the distributions. He decided where the funds were needed most. And clearly he knew that Colin and I were the better investment. You can wave those little black books around all you want, but it changes absolutely nothing about my life. I watched her cling to Colin, using him as a prop to demonstrate her picture-perfect marriage. I asked her why she was so confident. Savannah smiled, a sharp, vicious expression that mirrored my mother's. "Because you are too late," she gloated. "You thought you could come here and humiliate us and take everything back. But you cannot touch me. Dad transferred the deed of this entire estate into my name last month. He signed the property over to me completely. It is legally my house now. You cannot evict me. You cannot take it away. You literally paid for my mansion, Juliet. Thanks for the wedding gift." She looked around the yard, waiting for the guests to realize she was the ultimate winner. She wanted them to see that she had outsmarted the system and secured her wealth. Colin puffed out his chest, emboldened by his wife's aggressive stance. He told me I needed to leave his property before he called the police for trespassing. I did not look at Colin. I kept my eyes entirely on Savannah. The estate we were standing on was a massive, sprawling property. It had a 6-car garage, a heated infinity pool, and a private tennis court. It was the crown jewel of the neighborhood. Savannah had spent the last month bragging on social media about how she and Colin had finally purchased their dream home. She had thrown this lavish after-party specifically to show off the grounds to the country club elite. She thought she was untouchable because she had a piece of paper with her name on it. She thought a deed meant absolute ownership. The absolute certainty in her voice was almost sad. She was so used to having everything handed to her on a silver platter that she never bothered to check the details. She never read the fine print. She just assumed the world would always bend to her will. I slowly reached out and closed the second financial ledger. I rested my hands on top of the smooth leather. The jazz band was completely silent. The caterers had stopped pouring champagne. The entire party was holding its collective breath, waiting to see how the discarded younger sister would handle being defeated. I tilted my head, studying Savannah's triumphant face. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my lips. I asked her a very simple question. I asked her if she had bothered to look at the paperwork when my father transferred the property. I asked her if she had actually read the documents she signed so eagerly. Savannah frowned, her perfect smile slipping just a fraction. She told me she read the deed. She said her name was on the top line as the sole owner. I nodded slowly. I told her I was sure her name looked beautiful on the top line, but I asked her to think about the rest of the document. I explained to her how property transfers actually worked. I told her that when a house still has a massive mortgage attached to it, transferring the deed does not magically erase the debt. I explained that the bank, or in this case the private lending firm, still holds the ultimate power over the property. They hold the lien. They own the ground under her feet until every last penny is paid off. Savannah scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. She told me Dad had been paying the mortgage out of the trust. She said the house was in perfect standing. She told me I was just throwing out legal terms to scare her because I was jealous of her beautiful home. I let out a soft, dark chuckle. I told her I was not jealous of a house built on a foundation of lies. I asked her again, my voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. Did you happen to read the lien holder's name on that deed? Colin's face was stark white. He looked at Savannah, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror. He worked in finance even if his own startup was a failure. He understood exactly what a lien holder was. He understood that a deed meant absolutely nothing if the bank still owned the bricks, the roof, and the ground we were standing on. Savannah's perfectly manicured hands twitched. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She insisted her name was on the deed, which meant she owned the house free and clear. My father had promised her the house was a gift. Richard stepped forward, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. He ordered me to stop speaking. He yelled that I was spouting legal nonsense to confuse his daughter. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice to reassure the whispering neighbors that everything was perfectly fine, that I was just a bitter, jealous sibling trying to ruin a beautiful evening. Before Richard could spin another lie, a loud mechanical grinding noise echoed through the humid night air. Everyone turned their heads toward the front of the property. The massive, heavy wrought iron gates that enclosed Savannah's estate were slowly swinging open. The valet attendant scrambled out of the way. A sleek midnight black town car glided up the long paved driveway. The vehicle was completely out of place among the pastel-colored sports cars and family SUVs parked on the grass. It moved with a quiet, predatory grace, the tires crunching softly against the gravel as it bypassed the valet stand entirely and pulled right up to the edge of the main party tent. The jazz band remained dead silent. The guests held their breath. The heavy door of the town car opened and a man stepped out into the glow of the fairy lights. It was Mr. Carmichael. He was wearing a flawless, dark charcoal suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed and his expression was entirely devoid of emotion. He was a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies before his morning coffee. He radiated an aura of absolute terrifying authority. He did not look at the catering tables, the crystal champagne glasses, or the gawking socialites. He simply reached into the back seat, retrieved a thick, locked leather briefcase, and began walking directly toward me. The crowd parted for him instantly. People stepped back, pulling their evening gowns out of his path as if he were carrying a contagious disease. They could sense the shift in power. They could feel the sheer weight of the consequences walking across the lawn. Savannah stared at the approaching man, her mouth slightly open. She looked him up and down, taking in his tailored suit and the heavy briefcase. She let out a loud, mocking laugh, though the sound was brittle and shaking at the edges. She crossed her arms and glared at me. "Are you actually serious right now?" Savannah sneered, her voice dripping with artificial confidence. "Did you really bring a lawyer to a children's party? You are completely pathetic, Juliet. You are so desperate for attention that you hired an attorney to come threaten your own family over a house that does not even belong to you." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked my sister dead in the eye and delivered the truth. "No, Savannah," I replied calmly. "I brought your landlord." The color drained from Savannah's face in an instant. Her arms fell to her sides. Colin took a step back, putting physical distance between himself and his wife. Mr. Carmichael reached our circle. He did not introduce himself to the party. He did not even look at my father. Richard puffed out his chest and stepped directly into Mr. Carmichael's path, attempting to block him from reaching me. Richard demanded to know who this man was and who had authorized him to enter a private gated community. He shouted that he was the patriarch of this family, and he demanded respect. Mr. Carmichael did not even break his stride. He stepped neatly around my father, as if Richard were nothing more than a piece of misplaced lawn furniture. He walked straight up to me, opened the brass clasps of his leather briefcase, and pulled out a single thick stack of certified legal documents. The papers were bound in heavy blue cardstock sealed with official state stamps. "Good evening, Mrs. Juliet," Mr. Carmichael said, his voice smooth and professional, completely ignoring the chaos around us. "I have the finalized property records and the registered lien documents you requested. The default protocols have been officially triggered with the state as of 3 o'clock this afternoon." I thanked him and took the heavy stack of papers. I turned to face my father and my sister. I held the documents up so the entire crowd could see the official seals. I asked everyone to pay very close attention because this was a lesson in how real investments actually worked. I opened the first file. I began reading the legal text aloud, my voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. I read the details of the property transfer. I read the exact date Richard Wilson had signed the deed of the estate over to Savannah and Colin. I confirmed that Savannah's name was in fact on the property deed. Savannah let out a breath she had been holding. She turned to the crowd with a triumphant, sickly sweet smile. "See?" she announced loudly. "I told you! It is my house. She is just making things up because she is miserable." I held up my hand to stop her. I told her I was not finished reading. I flipped to the second page of the certified document. I read the section detailing the outstanding mortgage on the property. I read the exact total of the millions of dollars still owed on the estate. And then I read the name of the official lien holder, the entity that owned the debt, the entity that held the ultimate legal right to the property until the debt was paid in full. "The lien holder is Vanguard Holdings," Y announced, letting the name ring out. I looked at Richard, who was suddenly swaying on his feet. I looked at Savannah, who was staring at the documents with uncomprehending terror. "I own Vanguard Holdings," I reminded them, my voice turning to ice. "Therefore, I own the debt on this estate. I am the bank. I own the ground you are standing on." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy neighbors. Private school board members began whispering frantically to their spouses. They were watching a financial execution. I took a step closer to my father. I explained to the crowd exactly what Richard had done. I detailed how my father had taken a house that he did not own outright, a house that still carried millions in debt owed to my company, and illegally transferred the deed to Savannah without paying off the mortgage. I told everyone that transferring a deed without satisfying the lien was not just a mistake. It was not just a family misunderstanding. It is property fraud, I stated clearly. It is a federal crime. You committed fraud to give your favorite daughter a house you did not own using money you stole from me. Richard was hyperventilating. The arrogant, powerful patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered man. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, ruining his expensive haircut. He looked at the faces of his country club friends, realizing that his entire social standing was disintegrating into dust. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of wealth, and I had just exposed him as a fraud and a criminal in front of the only people whose opinions he cared about. He threw his hands up in the air, his voice cracking with desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at the documents in my hand. "That is a lie," Richard shouted, his eyes wild and panicked. He stepped toward me, trying to grab the papers, but Ethan smoothly intercepted him again, a silent, immovable barrier. Richard backed away, breathing heavily. "I did not commit fraud," Richard pleaded, turning to the crowd to plead his case. "I have been making the payments. I used the money from the family trust to pay the mortgage every single month. I swear to you the account is current. The bank has no right to trigger a default. I paid the bills. We are current on the house." He was begging them to believe him. He was clinging to the one piece of logic he thought could save him from total ruin. He believed that because he had been siphoning money out of my anonymous shell company, he had covered his tracks. He thought he was safe because he had used my own money to pay the debt he owed me. Savannah latched onto his defense immediately. She grabbed Colin's arm and nodded vigorously. "Dad has the receipts," she yelled. "We are current. You cannot evict us. You cannot take my house. You are just a vindictive liar trying to ruin my big night." I looked at my father. I looked at the sheer pathetic desperation on his face. I felt a profound sense of closure. The little girl who had spent her entire life begging for this man's approval was finally completely gone. I did not need him to love me. I just needed him to leave my life. I reached into the leather briefcase Mr. Carmichael was holding open. I pulled out the next stack of documents. They were bank statements. They were the precise, undeniable financial records of the Vanguard Holdings holding accounts. I looked at Richard. My expression was perfectly blank. I held the bank statements up for him to see. "No, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "No, you did not." I held the bank statements high enough for the string of fairy lights to illuminate the bold black text printed on the top page. Richard stared at the papers as if they were dipped in poison. His jaw worked silently, but no sound came out. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I told him that Vanguard Holdings had not received a single mortgage payment for this estate in 6 solid months. I read the dates aloud for the crowd. January, February, March, April, May, June. $0 had been transferred to the lien holder. Richard began to shake. He looked wildly around the tent, his eyes darting from his wealthy golf buddies to the private school board members. He swallowed hard and tried to project his voice, insisting there had to be a clerical error. He claimed his accountant must have routed the funds to the wrong escrow account. He swore to the whispering guests that he had authorized those withdrawals from the family trust himself. I nodded. I told him I absolutely agreed that he authorized the withdrawals. I flipped to the second page of the packet. I told the crowd that the money definitely left the family trust account. It just never went to the mortgage. I looked directly at Colin. My brother-in-law was standing perfectly still, his tailored suit suddenly looking a little too tight across his shoulders. He had been so eager to threaten me with police action just a few minutes ago. Now he looked like a man standing on a trap door waiting for the lever to be pulled. I read the wire transfer logs from the ledger. I detailed how exactly $80,000 a month was being bled from the family trust. I read the destination account aloud. It was a corporate account registered to Nexus Crypto Solutions. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Several men in expensive suits standing near the bar suddenly stood very straight. They were investors. They were the people Colin had been courting all evening, pitching them on his brilliant digital asset strategies. Colin took a step backward, his hands raising defensively. He stammered, his smooth catalog-ready face twisting into a mask of pure panic. He tried to laugh it off. He told the crowd that Richard was just an angel investor backing a highly lucrative digital venture. Colin said it was a private family partnership and perfectly legal. I did not let him finish the lie. I pulled a massive financial audit report from Mr. Carmichael's open briefcase. I slammed it down on top of the other ledgers. I told the entire party exactly what Nexus Crypto Solutions really was. I explained that Colin's groundbreaking tech startup had completely collapsed 9 months ago. I detailed the frozen assets, the failed digital coin launch, and the massive debts Colin had hidden from his own investors. I looked right at the group of men near the bar and told them Colin was broke. I told them his company was a hollow shell and he had been using them for free drinks and social clout all night. Colin turned stark white. He looked physically ill, swaying slightly as the men near the bar began to glare at him. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, turning into sharp, disgusted whispers. The socialites who had been fawning over Savannah and Colin all evening were now looking at them as if they had crawled out of a sewer. But I was not done with Colin. I turned to Savannah, who was staring at her husband in absolute shock. I told my sister that the money Richard stole from my company was not an angel investment. It was a bribe. I explained that when Colin's crypto scam went belly up, he had threatened to leave her. He threatened to pack his bags and file for divorce because the lavish lifestyle Savannah demanded was completely bankrupting him. He was broke, he was drowning in debt, and he wanted out. I looked at my father, who was staring at the ground, utterly defeated. I told the crowd that Richard could not handle the social embarrassment of his golden daughter getting divorced. He could not stomach the idea of the country club whispering about Savannah's failed marriage. So he bought Colin's loyalty. Richard siphoned my money, the money I secretly provided to keep him off the streets, and funneled it directly into Colin's dead company, just to keep him sleeping in Savannah's bed. The silence in the tent was absolute. The sheer depravity of the arrangement hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Colin was a bought man. Richard was an embezzler. And Savannah's perfect marriage was a paid subscription funded entirely by the sister she had abandoned at the altar. Patricia let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her hands. She knew it was over. The illusion was dead. The social currency she had hoarded for decades was entirely gone. Savannah's shock morphed into something ugly and feral. She could not accept the public humiliation. Her entire identity was tied to being better than me, more successful than me, more loved than me. She lunged forward, her emerald dress flashing under the lights. She pointed a finger inches from my face, her voice shrieking with raw, unhinged venom. She yelled that I was a liar. She told the crowd not to listen to a single word I said. She spun around desperately, trying to salvage her shattered image by tearing mine down. Savannah shouted that I was just a bitter, unstable dropout. She told the wealthy neighbors that I was insane and completely detached from reality. You told everyone I dropped out of my master's program because I could not handle the pressure, I said, my voice dangerously soft. You spent years telling your friends that I had a mental breakdown. Savannah laughed, a shrill, hysterical sound that grated against the quiet of the night. Because you did, she screamed. You are weak. You are pathetic. You could not handle real life, so you hid in your little office while I built a real family. You are a complete failure. I stepped into her space. I did not raise my voice, but the cold, heavy authority in my tone made her stop laughing immediately. I told Savannah to stop lying. I told her I was going to correct that specific piece of family mythology right here and right now. I turned to the crowd, making eye contact with the very people Savannah had lied to for years. I told them the truth. I did not drop out of my master's program because of academic pressure. I dropped out because I had to work 3 separate jobs. I worked overnight shifts at a diner, I worked at a corporate call center, and I took freelance coding gigs until my fingers bled. I did it because my credit score had been completely destroyed. I did it because debt collectors were calling my phone every single hour of the day. I looked back at my sister. The smug superiority was draining from her face, replaced by a rising, breathless terror. I dropped out to pay off the $40,000 in credit card debt that you racked up in my name, I stated, my voice echoing across the lawn. The gasps from the crowd were audible. Savannah shook her head, taking a step back, her eyes wide with panic. I explained how Savannah had stolen my social security number when I was 22. I detailed how she opened 3 separate platinum credit cards in my name to fund her designer wardrobe, her luxury vacations to Cabo, and her expensive dinners. When the bills came due, she completely ignored them. She let my credit tank. She let my financial future burn to the ground. I looked at Richard and Patricia. I told the crowd that when I discovered the fraud and threatened to go to the police, my parents begged me not to ruin Savannah's life. They told me Savannah was just young and made a mistake. They said she had a bright future ahead of her and a felony conviction for identity theft would destroy her chances of marrying well. They promised to pay me back every cent. They never paid me a single dime, I said, my gaze sweeping over my trembling parents. I had to drop out of my master's program to save myself from bankruptcy. I sacrificed my education to pay for Savannah's shoes. And my parents rewarded my sacrifice by telling all of you that I was a mentally unstable failure. Savannah was shaking. The guests were looking at her with open disgust. The private school admissions directors were actively backing away from her, pulling their spouses by the arm. She had been exposed not just as a fraud, but as a thief who preyed on her own sister. She lost her mind. The carefully curated mask of the wealthy suburban hostess completely dissolved. She screamed a high-pitched, guttural sound of pure rage. She turned to the waitstaff, the valet drivers, and the bartenders who were standing frozen around the perimeter of the tent. "Get her out of here!" Savannah shrieked, pointing wildly at me. "Throw her out! Get her off my property! She is trespassing. Call the police. Have her arrested. I want her physically removed right now." 2 caterers in white shirts took an uncertain step forward, clearly uncomfortable but compelled by the screaming woman who was supposedly paying their invoice. Ethan did not wait for them to make a mistake. He moved with a sudden, fluid speed, stepping directly between me and the approaching staff. He did not raise his fists. He did not need to. His sheer physical presence, combined with the cold, unyielding look in his eyes, was an absolute deterrent. He stood like a quiet, intimidating wall of solid granite. The caterers stopped dead in their tracks. Ethan looked at the staff, then looked directly at Savannah. His voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a lethal edge that cut right through her hysterical screaming. "I would not do that. Ethan said calmly, his eyes locking onto my sister. She owns the ground you are standing on. The caterers froze. Ethan stood with his shoulders squared, his gaze locked on the waitstaff, radiating a quiet, unyielding authority. The two men in white shirts took one look at his imposing stance, glanced down at the certified legal documents scattered across the buffet table, and slowly backed away. They placed their silver serving trays onto the nearest table and retreated into the shadows of the lawn. They wanted absolutely no part in this execution. Savannah stood with her mouth opening and closing silently, stripped of her arrogance, entirely unable to process the reality of her situation. Her husband Colin was already taking slow, deliberate steps backward, distancing himself from the woman whose stolen wealth had just been exposed. Patricia realized that the battle of logic and financial records was completely lost. The ledgers were indisputable. The deed was a trap. Her husband was cornered, and her golden child was humiliated. Patricia knew she had only one weapon left in her arsenal. She had to pivot to emotion. She had to weaponize the audience. Patricia stepped right into the center of the party tent. She let out a loud theatrical gasp, bringing both hands up to cover her face. When she pulled them away, tears were streaming down her cheeks. They were real tears born of sheer panic, but she wielded them like an Oscar-winning actress. She turned to the wealthy socialites, the private school board members, and the country club elite who were watching the scene with rapt, horrified attention. "Please," Patricia cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated maternal anguish. "Please forgive this terrible display. My poor daughter is sick. She is so incredibly sick." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Patricia pressed her advantage, stepping closer to the nearest group of women, clasping her hands together as if praying for their understanding. "Juliet has always had an active imagination," Patricia lied, wiping a tear from her jaw. "But the stress of planning this wedding, the pressure of trying to build her little business, it has completely broken her mind. She is having a mental breakdown right in front of us. She is hallucinating these ridiculous stories about shell companies and stolen money. We have been trying to get her psychiatric help for months, but she refuses to take her medication. Please do not listen to her. She does not know what she is saying." Richard seized the lifeline his wife had thrown him. He nodded vigorously, adopting the posture of a weary, heartbroken father. He stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture toward the guests. "My wife is right," Richard announced, injecting a tone of deep, sorrowful regret into his voice. "We tried to keep this family tragedy private. We wanted to protect Juliet from public embarrassment, which is why we could not attend her wedding today. We were consulting with medical professionals to arrange an intervention. She is deeply unwell. These documents are nothing but forged delusions created by a sick mind." The guests looked uncertain. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, and so intensely manipulative that for a fraction of a second, the crowd hesitated. They looked at my wedding gown, my calm demeanor, and then back at my weeping mother. Patricia was playing the victim with absolute perfection. I watched her perform. I did not yell. I did not defend my sanity. I simply reached down and picked up my phone from the buffet table. I bypassed my parents entirely and walked directly over to the raised platform where the live jazz band had been playing. The musicians took one look at my face and immediately stepped aside. I walked up to their professional soundboard. I tapped the screen of my phone, opened the settings menu, and paired my device to the massive Bluetooth public address system that was wired into the corners of the giant party tent. The speakers emitted a low electronic hum as the connection was established. I picked up the main microphone from its stand and turned to face the crowd. My voice boomed out across the manicured lawn, echoing into the dark suburban night. "My mother is right about one thing," I announced to the hundreds of staring guests. "I have been under a tremendous amount of stress. I am exhausted. I am tired of the lies, the theft, and the endless manipulation. But I am not sick. And I am certainly not crazy." I kept my eyes locked on Patricia, whose fake tears suddenly stopped flowing. "Last night, while I was preparing for my wedding, my mother called me to cancel her attendance at my rehearsal dinner," I explained to the silent crowd. "She gave me a beautiful, tearful excuse about feeling unwell. But when she finished delivering her lies, she forgot to press the end button on her phone. She left a 4-minute voicemail on my device. Patricia went completely rigid. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. Richard took a sudden, panicked step toward the stage, but Ethan shifted his weight, blocking the path once again. I think it is only fair that you hear exactly what my family sounds like when they think no one is listening, I said into the microphone. I pressed play on my phone screen. The audio crackled through the massive high-fidelity speakers. The recording was incredibly clear, capturing the ambient noise of clinking wine glasses in the background. And then Patricia's voice filled the tent. It was not the weeping, sorrowful voice she had just used to beg the crowd for sympathy. It was sharp, vicious, and dripping with malicious venom. I cannot believe we even have to pretend to care about this cheap little dinner, Patricia's recorded voice spat through the speakers. Her budget wedding is an absolute embarrassment. I am not sitting in some drafty chapel watching her marry a man who works for a living. The crowd gasped. Several women who had been looking at Patricia with sympathy a moment ago immediately recoiled in disgust. Then Savannah's voice joined the recording, followed by a cruel, mocking laugh. Just tell her you have a migraine. Mom Savannah's recorded voice echoed across the lawn. She will believe it. She believes everything. She is so desperate for you to love her that she never questions anything Dad does with the accounts. In the center of the tent, Savannah covered her face with her hands, shaking her head frantically, as her own words betrayed her to her wealthy friends. She is a useful idiot. Patricia's voice continued through the massive speakers, the casual cruelty ringing out with devastating clarity. But we only have to tolerate her for a little while longer. Your father reviewed the holding accounts this morning. There is still almost $400,000 in liquid cash sitting in her shell company. The private school admissions directors, the bank managers, and the local elite stared at my family in absolute horror. The explicit confirmation of the embezzlement was broadcasting live to their entire social circle. Savannah's recorded voice chimed in again, greedy and impatient. Good! When can we pull the trigger on the Aspen house? I am tired of renting a ski lodge when the Montgomerys own their own cabin. Just give it 6 more months, Patricia's voice answered smoothly, sounding entirely at peace with destroying her own daughter's life. Your father is going to drain the remaining liquid assets from the Vanguard account to cover the down payment on the Aspen property. Once the cash is gone, we will stop paying the mortgage on your estate. We will let the holding company go completely bankrupt. We will leave Juliet holding the bag for the entire collapse, and by the time she realizes the money is gone, the assets will already be legally transferred and hidden in offshore accounts. She will be ruined, and we will be set for life. The recording ended with the sharp click of the phone finally disconnecting. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating and deafening. The live broadcast of their premeditated fraud hung over the party like a toxic cloud. There was no spinning this. There was no gaslighting their way out of a recorded confession. The crowd had just listened to a mother and a sister cheerfully plot the total financial and personal destruction of their own flesh and blood. The social elite of the neighborhood did not just look shocked. They looked violently disgusted. The people Richard and Patricia had spent their entire lives trying to impress were now looking at them as if they were venomous snakes. A prominent local judge standing near the bar placed his champagne glass down and turned his back on my father. 2 wealthy socialites linked arms and began walking briskly toward the valet stand, desperate to escape the blast radius of this monumental scandal. The social ruin was instantaneous and complete. Patricia stood completely frozen in the center of the tent. Her hands were clamped over her mouth in pure, unadulterated horror. Her eyes were wide, staring at the speakers as if they were monsters. The mask was completely ripped off. Everyone knew exactly what she was. Richard lost his mind. The realization that he had lost his money, his stolen estate, his reputation, and quite possibly his freedom, finally snapped whatever fragile restraint he had left. His face contorted into a mask of violent, unhinged rage. He roared a sound of pure fury and charged toward the stage. "Turn it off!" Richard screamed. His fists clenched, spit flying from his mouth as he marched aggressively toward me. "Give me that phone right now. I am going to break that phone into 1,000 pieces. You ungrateful, vindictive little liar." He lunged forward, raising his hand fully intending to strike me down and take the device by force. I stood perfectly still on the raised platform. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I did not even look at Ethan for protection. I kept my eyes locked on the raging, pathetic man charging toward me. I reached deep into the hidden silk pocket of my wedding gown. Richard's breathing was ragged and harsh, tearing from his lungs like a dying engine. His face was stained a dark, bruised shade of purple, the heavy veins in his neck bulging dangerously against the starched collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked nothing like the polished, untouchable patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist for decades. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. Ethan shifted his weight seamlessly, his broad shoulders squaring as his muscles tensed beneath his dark suit. He was ready to dismantle my father before Richard could take another single step. But I held up my left hand. It was a small, sharp motion. Ethan stopped immediately, holding his ground but trusting my command entirely. I did not need a physical shield tonight. I needed my father to face the absolute reality of his own reflection. Richard slammed to a halt just inches away from the edge of the raised platform. The sheer, overwhelming presence of hundreds of silent, staring witnesses finally penetrated the red mist of his panicked mind. He realized he could not strike me. He could not physically rip the phone from my hand or throw me out of the tent without ending up in the back of a police cruiser before midnight. His stolen money could not save him. His social reputation was obliterated, and his intimidation tactics were entirely useless. So he resorted to the only weapon he had left in his pathetic arsenal. He weaponized the hierarchy he had worshipped his entire life. "I am your father!" Richard roared, his voice cracking with a desperate, furious entitlement. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my chest, trying to project a dominance that no longer existed. "You will give me the respect I deserve, and you will leave my property." The silence that followed his demand was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that magnified the sheer, staggering absurdity of his words. My property. He was standing on grass that my holding company legally owned. He was breathing the humid evening air under a massive event tent that my money had paid for. He had stolen my identity, siphoned my bank accounts, handed my house to his favorite child, and plotted to leave me destitute and ruined. And yet, standing in the ashes of his own destruction, he still demanded my respect. He still demanded my blind obedience. I did not argue with his delusion. I did not scream back to defend myself. I simply looked him dead in the eye, maintaining a terrifying icy calm, and reached deep into the hidden silk pocket of my wedding gown. The crowd held its collective breath. Private school board members leaned forward, their champagne glasses suspended in mid-air. Wealthy tech investors watched in fascinated horror. They clearly expected me to pull out another certified legal document. They expected another damning financial ledger, a printed bank statement, or a drafted police report. Instead, I pulled out a single jagged piece of cheap brass attached to a bright orange piece of plastic. I stepped down from the wooden platform, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. I walked directly up to my father, invading his personal space. He instinctively raised his hands, a defensive, cowering posture born of pure fear. I reached out and dropped the object directly into his trembling, sweaty palm. The cheap metal made a dull, pathetic clinking sound as it hit his skin. Richard stared down at his hand. His eyes widened as his brain struggled to process the visual information. It was not a signed deed. It was not a blank check. It was a standard room key attached to a heavily scratched neon orange diamond of cheap plastic. The number 42 was stamped onto the plastic tag in fading black ink. "What is this?" Richard stammered, his voice dropping to a hoarse, trembling whisper. He looked at the brightly colored key tag, as if I had just handed him a live, ticking explosive. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I made sure my voice carried clearly enough for the front row of gawking socialites to hear every single syllable. "Those are the keys to a budget motel downtown," I said, my tone completely devoid of any trace of sympathy. I paid for 2 nights. Because you have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property. The words hit Richard with the force of a physical blow. His knees actually buckled under his weight. He stumbled backward, dropping the cheap plastic key onto the perfectly manicured grass. The neon orange tag lay there, a glaring, ugly reminder of his immediate future, resting right next to the polished toe of his $2,000 leather dress shoe. Behind him, Patricia let out a sound that I had never heard before. It was not her usual theatrical gasp or her practiced delicate weeping designed to garner sympathy. It was a guttural, wretched wail. The undeniable reality of the eviction had finally pierced her thick wall of denial. She realized that she was not just losing her pristine social standing. She was losing her home. She was losing her king-sized bed, her expansive designer closet, her wine cellar, and her prestigious address. Patricia sank to her knees right there in the middle of the party tent. The heavy silk of her expensive evening gown pooled into the damp grass, soaking up the mud. She reached out with shaking hands, grabbing the hem of a nearby woman's dress, begging for help. "Martha, please," Patricia sobbed, looking up at the wife of a prominent local judge. "We have known each other for years. Please tell her she cannot do this to us." Martha looked down at my mother with an expression of sheer, unadulterated repulsion. She yanked her dress out of Patricia's frantic grip, as if my mother were carrying a highly contagious disease. Martha turned her back, took her husband's arm, and marched directly toward the exit. That single action broke the dam. The entire crowd began to move at once. It was a mass, frantic exodus of the suburban elite. They were fleeing the scene of a social massacre. No one wanted to be associated with an exposed embezzler. No one wanted to be photographed standing near a family that was being actively evicted from their own lavish party. The guests pushed past the catering tables, abandoning their half-eaten hors d'oeuvres, their expensive heels sinking into the grass as they scrambled for the valet stand. I watched the neighbors leave, completely indifferent to their panic. Then I looked over at Colin. My brother-in-law was standing near the far edge of the tent. His eyes were darting rapidly, calculating the catastrophic odds of his situation. He was a superficial finance bro who had just been exposed as a massive, fraudulent failure. His crypto company was dead. His professional reputation was ruined. His father-in-law was penniless, and the gravy train had officially derailed. Colin looked at Savannah, who was currently hyperventilating near the buffet table. He looked at the certified lien documents still resting next to the silver catering trays. Colin made his decision with ruthless efficiency. He did not say a word to his wife. He did not offer comfort or a plan. He simply turned around and slipped out of the tent, disappearing into the dark shadows of the long driveway, abandoning Savannah to face the absolute wreckage of her life alone. Savannah saw him leave. "Colin," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Colin, come back here." He did not turn around. His rapid footsteps faded into the night. The realization that she was completely alone, completely broke, and completely exposed hit Savannah like a speeding freight train. The golden child, the favorite daughter. The woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself completely lost her grip on reality. She stared down at the cheap neon motel key lying in the dirt. Then she looked up at the heavy wrought iron gates towering at the end of the paved driveway. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unhinged entitlement. "I am not leaving," Savannah screamed, her voice tearing through the humid night air, shrill and deafening. "You cannot make me leave. I live here. My clothes are here. My life is here. You are just jealous of me. You have always been jealous of me. I am not going anywhere. I have squatter rights." The few remaining caterers who were still hovering near the kitchen entrance stared at her in utter silent disbelief. A grown woman wearing a $5,000 emerald designer gown, standing under a rented crystal chandelier, screaming about squatters' rights because she refused to vacate a stolen mansion. It was the ultimate pathetic display of desperate privilege. Savannah stomped her foot, her stiletto heel sinking deep into the mud. "I get mail here," she shrieked, pointing wildly at the massive mahogany front doors of the estate. "You cannot just kick people out on the street tonight. It takes months to formally evict someone. The law protects me. I am going to go inside. I am going to lock all the doors. And I am going to call the police on you for trespassing. You are not taking my house. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic hysteria. I did not argue the legalities of property law or formal eviction notices with a woman who had just been caught on tape plotting to steal my identity and my life savings. I simply stood my ground, allowing her to exhaust her own breath, watching her flail against the inevitable consequences of her own actions. I slowly raised my left arm. I looked down at my wrist, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I deliberately checked my watch, noting the precise placement of the hands. I looked back up at Savannah. My expression was perfectly calm, an anchor of stone in the middle of her raging storm. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. I thought you might say that, I replied. I thought you might say that, I replied. The ground beneath our feet began to physically vibrate. It was a low, heavy mechanical rumble that started at the bottom of the hill and steadily grew louder, drowning out the frantic whispering of the remaining guests. The few socialites who had managed to reach the valet stand suddenly stopped in their tracks, shielding their eyes against a barrage of blinding high-beam headlights cutting through the darkness. The heavy wrought iron gates, which Savannah had insisted remain propped wide open for her grand party, were now completely blocked. 3 massive commercial-grade moving trucks, painted in stark industrial gray, were grinding their way up the long paved driveway. They did not care about the pristine landscaping or the delicate string lights hanging overhead. The lead truck rolled aggressively over a bed of imported white roses, its massive dual tires crushing the flowers deep into the mud as the driver angled the vehicle perfectly in front of the grand mahogany entrance of the estate. The sharp hissing sound of heavy air brakes releasing echoed like a gunshot across the manicured lawn. The doors of the trucks opened in perfect unison. A dozen men stepped out into the humid night air. They were not wearing the casual polo shirts of a standard moving company. They were a specialized bonded lockout and repossession team dressed in tactical black, their expressions entirely devoid of emotion. They carried heavy-duty plastic packing crates, rolls of industrial tape, and thick metal clipboards. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. They were flanked by a private security detail consisting of 4 men with broad shoulders and earpieces who immediately fanned out to secure the perimeter of the house. Savannah's manic screaming caught in her throat. She stared at the trucks, her eyes wide, her jaw hanging entirely slack. She looked back at me, waiting for an explanation, but her mind was clearly fracturing under the crushing weight of her new reality. I took a deliberate step forward, addressing not just my sister, but the entire remaining crowd of fleeing guests. I explained that squatters' rights were a comforting fairy tale, invented by people who did not understand corporate law. I told her that I had caught the very first missing mortgage payment exactly 6 months ago. I did not act immediately. I waited. I watched Richard scramble. I built an airtight legal case behind the scenes. And exactly 30 days ago, I filed the formal commercial notice of default and the intent to evict. I looked directly at Richard. My father flinched violently, refusing to meet my gaze as he clutched the cheap plastic motel key in his sweating hand. I told the crowd that the legal documents had been successfully served to the registered agent of the family trust. Richard had received the notice in his own hands. He knew this day was coming. He simply chose to throw away the certified letters, arrogantly believing that he could stall the bank with a few phone calls to his wealthy friends. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the rules did not apply to him. But today, at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the legal grace period expired. The final writ of possession was stamped and signed by a superior court judge. This was no longer his property. It belonged to Vanguard Holdings. The lead security agent, a tall, imposing man named Vance, clicked his pen and gestured for his team to advance toward the front doors. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the dark shadows of the wrap-around porch. It was Colin. He had not run away down the street after all. He had sprinted straight for the house the moment the audio recording played, desperately trying to beat the lockout team to the door so he could secure his expensive watches and hidden cash before the locks were changed. Colin stood at the top of the marble steps, breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his forehead and completely ruining his expensive haircut. He spread his arms wide, placing his hands flat against the carved mahogany doorframe in a pathetic display of territorial dominance. He puffed out his chest, trying to project the aura of a powerful finance CEO in front of the investors who were watching from the lawn. Colin shouted that no one was entering his house. He yelled that they were trespassing on private property. He screamed that he knew his rights, and he would sue every single person in a black shirt into absolute bankruptcy if they took another step onto his porch. The security team did not even break their stride. They simply kept walking up the stone steps in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Before Vance could address the screaming man, Ethan moved. My husband stepped out from the glow of the party tent, gliding across the lawn with that quiet, lethal grace that always terrified my family. He walked directly up the marble stairs, his dark suit blending into the shadows, and stopped exactly 1 foot away from Colin. Colin tried to maintain his tough guy facade, jutting his chin out defiantly, but I could clearly see his knees shaking beneath his tailored trousers. Ethan did not yell. He did not raise his fists. He spoke in a voice so incredibly calm, so measured, and so profoundly dangerous that the entire yard fell dead silent to listen. Ethan told Colin that the men standing behind him were court-appointed bonded agents executing a legal writ signed by a superior court judge. He explained using precise and chilling legal terminology that if Colin refused to move from the doorway, he would be guilty of obstructing a court order. Ethan took a fraction of a step closer. He lowered his voice, letting the absolute certainty of his words sink in. He explained that if Colin allowed even a single finger to brush against one of the agents, it would instantly be classified as felony assault and battery against an officer of the court. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes boring straight into Colin's soul. He promised Colin that if he did not lower his arms in exactly 3 seconds, he would be placed in heavy steel handcuffs, dragged off the porch by his collar, and thrown into a holding cell before he could even pick up a phone to call a lawyer. Colin's bravado evaporated into thin air. The illusion of his power shattered completely. He looked at Ethan's unwavering stare, then looked at the 4 massive security guards standing right behind him. Colin swallowed hard. He slowly dropped his arms to his sides, stepping away and shrinking against the stone pillar as the security team marched past him and pushed the massive mahogany doors wide open. Savannah watched her husband submit from the grass below. She watched strange men walk right into her pristine designer foyer carrying stacks of empty cardboard boxes. The reality finally broke her completely. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed off the surrounding mansions, a sound so shrill it made the remaining guests cover their ears. She dug frantically into her designer clutch, her hands shaking violently as she pulled out her phone. She punched the numbers onto the screen, pressing the phone hard to her ear, as tears of pure rage and panic streamed down her flushed face. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Savannah screamed into the receiver. She told the operator that she was being robbed. She yelled that a dozen armed intruders were invading her home, violently assaulting her husband, and trying to murder her family. She begged for the police to come immediately, delivering a masterclass performance of a helpless victim trapped in the middle of a violent home invasion. She gave the address, screamed for help one last time, and ended the call. Savannah turned to me, a sickening, triumphant sneer fighting through her tears. She pointed her phone at me like a weapon. She told me I had made the biggest mistake of my life. She told me I was going to prison for orchestrating a home invasion. She told me I was finished. I did not say a word. I simply stood on the grass, feeling the absolute, unshakable stability of the ground beneath my feet. I looked at Savannah, who was gasping for air. I looked at my mother, who was still weeping silently into the mud. And I looked at my father, who was staring down at the cheap orange motel key, resting in his palm as if it were his own gravestone. In the far distance, cutting sharply through the heavy, humid night air, a high wail began to echo down the valley. The sound multiplied quickly, growing louder and more frantic by the second. The sirens were approaching rapidly, rushing toward the estate to answer Savannah's call. The wail of the sirens grew deafening, bouncing off the massive brick facades of the surrounding neighborhood and shattering the quiet suburban night. Red and blue strobe lights pierced the heavy humidity. washing over the pale faces of the remaining catering staff and painting the sides of the industrial moving trucks in violent flashing colors. Two police cruisers tore up the long paved driveway, their tires chewing through the pristine landscaping as they bypassed the abandoned valet stand and skidded to a halt just inches from the lead tactical vehicle. Savannah did not miss a single beat. The moment the first officer stepped out of his cruiser, she launched into the theatrical performance of a lifetime. She threw herself across the damp lawn, stumbling dramatically in her ruined emerald designer gown, tears streaming down her face in thick mascara-stained rivers. She grabbed the officer's uniform sleeve, sobbing with a wild, hysterical energy. She pointed a manicured, shaking finger directly at me, and Ethan screaming that we were violent criminals. She wailed that we had orchestrated an armed home invasion, that we were threatening the lives of her innocent guests, and that we were trying to physically harm her children. She painted a picture of absolute terror, casting herself as the innocent, defenseless mother trapped by ruthless, heavily armed intruders. She demanded our immediate arrest, her voice breaking with perfectly practiced, fragile desperation. She clung to the officer, pleading for him to draw his weapon and protect her family from the monsters trespassing on her lawn. The two officers immediately went on high alert. They unclipped the retention straps on their holsters, their postures rigid and defensive as they took in the chaotic, unprecedented scene. They saw the massive tactical security team, the three idling commercial moving trucks, the scattered legal documents on the buffet tables, and the sheer scale of the disruption. They moved past Savannah, positioning themselves firmly between my weeping sister and the private security contractors standing on the marble porch. Richard saw the police arrive and instantly puffed up his chest, his arrogant patriarchal programming kicking back into overdrive. He stepped forward to stand beside his daughter, attempting to leverage his ruined social status one last time. He told the officers that he was the rightful owner of this estate, a prominent member of the local country club, and that he demanded these trespassers be removed by lethal force if necessary. He barked orders at the cops, as if they were his own private security detail, assuming his wealth and white hair would automatically grant him absolute authority over the situation. He demanded that Ethan and I be placed in handcuffs immediately for terrorizing his family. The lead officer raised a firm hand, instantly silencing my father, and turned his stern gaze directly toward me. He rested his hand on his duty belt, demanding to know who was in charge of the private security team and what exactly was happening on this property. I did not need to say a single word or take a single step forward. Mr. Carmichael glided into the center of the confrontation, with the smooth, unbothered elegance of a man who had orchestrated hostile corporate takeovers worth billions of dollars. He did not look intimidated by the flashing police lights, the aggressive posture of the officers, or Richard's furious shouting. He simply opened his thick leather briefcase and produced a pristine blue-backed legal folder. He approached the lead officer smoothly, introducing himself as the chief legal counsel for Vanguard Holdings. Mr. Carmichael handed the heavy folder directly to the officer. He explained in a voice as calm and steady as a placid lake that the police had not been called to a home invasion. He stated that they had been called to a legally sanctioned court-ordered property seizure. He pointed to the top document highlighting the official embossed seal of the State Superior Court. He flipped to the second page, showing the officer the signed writ of possession. He turned to the third page, revealing the undeniable proof of ownership, transferring the estate entirely to Vanguard Holdings due to severe undisputed mortgage default. He provided the exact dates the notices were served, the exact name of the agent who signed for them, and the exact hour the grace period had expired. The officer took a small tactical flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, sweeping the bright white beam across the dense legal paperwork. The second officer stepped closer, reading over his partner's shoulder, his hand slowly moving away from his holster. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like physical pressure. Savannah stopped crying entirely, her breath catching painfully in her throat as she watched the officer's eyes scan the undeniable legal truth of her ruin. Richard stood completely frozen, his blustering confidence evaporating into the night air as the police read the exact details of his financial failure and property fraud. The private security team remained perfectly still, radiating a quiet professional menace as they waited for the local authorities to process the facts. The lead officer clicked his flashlight off. He closed the blue folder and handed it back to Mr. Carmichael with a respectful nod. The shift in the officer's demeanor was instantaneous and absolute. The defensive posture vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened professional irritation. They realized they had been lied to. They realized they had been weaponized by a hysterical woman throwing a temper tantrum over a legal eviction. The lead officer turned slowly to face Savannah and Richard. He did not look at them with sympathy. He looked at them with the stern, unforgiving authority of the law. "Ma'am, you are legally trespassing." The officer stated, his voice ringing out with absolute finality. "You need to vacate the premises immediately or you will be arrested." Savannah physically recoiled as if she had been slapped across the face. Her jaw dropped open. She looked from the officer to Richard, expecting her father to magically fix the situation with his money or his influence. But Richard was completely silent. He was staring at the grass, his shoulders slumped, looking like a broken hollow shell of a man. He had no power left to wield. He had no money left to spend. The hierarchy he had worshipped had completely abandoned him. "You cannot be serious!" Savannah gasped, her voice trembling with genuine panic now. "You cannot do this. I live here. This is my house. You are supposed to arrest her." She pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is the one stealing my life." The second officer stepped forward, his tone dropping into a sharp, unyielding warning. "The property belongs to Vanguard Holdings, ma'am," he said clearly. "You have been served a lawful eviction mandate signed by a superior court judge. You have zero legal right to be standing on this grass. The property owner has generously granted you 1 hour to gather your immediate personal necessities and vacate. I suggest you stop arguing and start packing, or we will place you in handcuffs and remove you by force." Savannah let out a ragged, suffocating gasp. The reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her with the weight of a collapsing building. There was no loophole. There was no socialite friend coming to save her. Colin had already fled into the night, abandoning her to face the consequences alone. She was entirely out of options. A primal, terrified realization took over her completely. If she was being thrown out tonight, she was going to be homeless. She needed cash. She needed her assets. She needed the things she had hoarded to prove her superiority to the world. Savannah spun around her high heels, tearing through the mud, and sprinted frantically toward the open mahogany front doors of the estate. She shoved past the tactical security guards, screaming at the top of her lungs, ignoring the flashing police lights and the staring caterers. She vanished into the grand foyer, her frantic footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The lead officer sighed heavily, shaking his head. He gestured for 2 of the private security contractors to follow her inside and ensure she did not damage the property or attempt to take anything bolted to the walls. For the next 20 minutes, the front lawn was a scene of pathetic, frantic chaos. Savannah burst out of the front doors repeatedly, her hair wild and completely unkempt. She was dragging massive, heavy loads of luxury luggage down the marble steps. She hauled out matching sets of pristine Chanel suitcases, kicking them down the stairs when they got too heavy. She sprinted back inside and emerged carrying armfuls of limited edition Birkin bags, throwing them carelessly onto the damp grass. She dragged out Louis Vuitton garment bags, stuffed to the breaking point with designer dresses, shoes, and jewelry. She was hyperventilating, sweating through her ruined emerald gown, acting like a looter raiding a sinking ship. She grabbed the handle of the largest Chanel suitcase and began dragging it aggressively toward her white Range Rover, parked near the edge of the driveway. She popped the trunk, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate the latch. She grabbed the handle of the suitcase, preparing to heave it into the back of her vehicle. Before she could lift the bag off the grass, a heavy gloved hand clamped down firmly over hers. Savannah shrieked and whipped her head around. The lead police officer was standing right beside her. He easily pulled her hand off the leather handle and stepped between her and the open trunk of the Range Rover. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the luggage," the officer commanded, his voice tight with authority. Savannah looked at him as if he had grown a second head. "What are you doing?" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "These are my bags. These are my things. I am packing like you told me to. Get out of my way." I walked slowly across the grass, my wedding dress gliding over the crushed white roses. Ethan walked silently beside me, his presence a constant grounding force. I stopped right next to the police officer, looking down at the pile of extravagant, outrageously expensive designer luggage scattered across the lawn. I looked up at Savannah. Her eyes were bloodshot, wild, and pleading. She knew exactly what I was about to say. I pointed a steady finger directly at the mountain of Chanel, Louis Vuitton, and Hermes leather. Those bags were purchased using credit cards opened fraudulently in my name. I stated, my voice echoing clearly over the rumble of the moving trucks. The dresses, the jewelry, and the luggage were all funded by corporate assets embezzled directly from Vanguard Holdings by Richard Wilson. I looked my sister dead in the eye, watching the last remaining shred of her arrogance shatter into dust. "They are stolen property," I said, a cold, final smile touching the corners of my mouth. "They stay." The police officer looked from my pointing finger to the mountain of designer luggage resting in the wet grass. He did not ask for further clarification. The evidence provided by Mr. Carmichael had already established that the assets on this property were subject to a corporate freeze. The officer placed his hand firmly on Savannah's shoulder and pulled her away from the open trunk of the white Range Rover. He instructed the private security team to impound the luggage immediately. Savannah shrieked. She clawed at the air, screaming that those bags were her personal property, that she needed her jewelry, her limited edition, watches, her irreplaceable art pieces, and her custom wardrobe. She wailed that I had no right to steal her things. The officer was entirely unmoved by her hysterics. He signaled to one of the lockout agents, who calmly walked over and handed my sister 3 heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. The officer told her she had exactly 40 minutes left to pack basic non-luxury clothing, daily toiletries, and essential medication. Everything else remained on site pending the forensic audit of Vanguard Holdings. The image of the neighborhood golden child, the woman who had tormented me for decades, standing in a ruined $5,000 gown holding a roll of cheap black trash bags, was a portrait of absolute poetic justice. She wept uncontrollably as she was escorted back into the mansion by 2 large security contractors. They followed her directly into the Grand Master Suite, standing with their arms crossed, while she was forced to dig through drawers of diamond tennis bracelets and silk lingerie just to pack cheap cotton sweatpants and basic underwear into the garbage bags. She pleaded to keep a single Cartier watch, claiming it had sentimental value, but the agent simply pointed to the black plastic bag, his face unreadable. Every time she tried to slip a velvet jewelry box or a small designer accessory into the plastic sack, the guard stepped forward and forced her to put it right back. She was even instructed to remove the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. The humiliation was absolute, suffocating, and entirely of her own making. While Savannah was being supervised inside the stolen mansion, a sudden aggressive roar echoed across the driveway. The deep guttural sound of a high-performance engine starting up cut sharply through the ambient noise of the idling moving trucks and the crackling police radios. I turned my head. Colin had not just slipped away to hide in the shadows of the lawn. He had used the distraction of the police arrival to sprint directly to his dark gray Aston Martin parked near the perimeter gates. He threw his own hastily packed duffel bag into the passenger seat and slammed the heavy door. He had seen the police reviewing the corporate fraud documents with Mr. Carmichael. He knew that a deep forensic audit of my father's stolen holding company would inevitably lead directly to his own fraudulent tech startup. The initial seed money Richard had funneled to him to launch his business was entirely illegal. Colin's entire empire was built on stolen cash, and the moment the accountants started digging through Richard's ledgers, Colin would be facing a federal indictment. He was not going to wait around to be linked to Richard's sinking ship. He was cutting his losses. Savannah emerged from the grand front doors, dragging 2 bulging black garbage bags behind her. She heard the powerful roar of the Aston Martin and looked up. Her eyes went wide with sheer terror. She dropped the heavy plastic bags on the marble steps and sprinted across the damp grass toward the driveway. She reached the sports car just as Colin shifted into gear. She slapped her hands flat against the tinted passenger window, leaving muddy handprints on the pristine glass. She begged him to open the door. She screamed his name, pleading with him to unlock the car and take her away from this nightmare. She yelled that they needed to leave together, that they needed to escape before the police started asking more questions. Colin did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight in grim determination. He reached down and hit the power lock button, the mechanical click sealing him securely inside. Savannah pounded her fists frantically against the window, her voice cracking as she sobbed, begging her husband not to leave her stranded in the mud. Colin pressed his foot down hard on the accelerator. The sports car lunged forward with terrifying speed, the rear tires spinning wildly on the wet pavement before catching traction. He sped down the long driveway, swerving recklessly around the parked police cruisers and the massive moving trucks. He did not touch the brakes as he shot through the open wrought iron gates and disappeared into the dark suburban night. Savannah stumbled forward as the car pulled away, losing her balance and falling hard onto her hands and knees in the middle of the paved driveway. She remained there, a crumpled, sobbing mess of ruined silk and mud, entirely abandoned by the man she had married for status and wealth. Patricia and Richard stood a few yards away near the empty buffet tables, watching their perfect, wealthy son-in-law flee the scene of their crimes. The shock of Colin's ruthless desertion acted as the final catalyst for my parents. The immaculate, bulletproof facade of the Wilson family did not just crack. It violently and spectacularly imploded. Patricia whirled around to face my father. Her face, usually so perfectly composed and treated to present a mask of serene superiority, was contorted with absolute vicious fury. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at Richard and unleashed decades of suppressed venom. She screamed that this was entirely his fault. She shrieked that he was a pathetic, incompetent fool who could not even manage to steal from his own daughter properly. She detailed his failed investments, his bad business deals, and how she had to constantly cover for his financial incompetence at their elite dinner parties. She blamed him for getting caught, for exposing them to financial ruin, and for single-handedly destroying their untouchable social standing. Richard stared at his wife, his own face flushing a dangerous, explosive shade of crimson. The man who demanded absolute respect and submission from everyone around him completely snapped. He lunged toward Patricia, his voice booming across the lawn as he hurled the blame right back at her. He screamed that she was a greedy, bottomless pit of a woman who cared more about country club memberships than common sense. He roared that the only reason he had to siphon funds from my accounts in the first place was to cover her astronomical credit card bills and fund Savannah's endless, ridiculous demands for luxury. He reminded her of the $50,000 kitchen renovations she demanded while his accounts were running dry. He pointed a shaking hand at Savannah, who was still weeping loudly in the driveway, and yelled that Patricia had spoiled her into a useless, entitled parasite who contributed nothing to the family. Patricia shrieked back, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the neighboring estates. She called Richard a weak, cowardly provider who had always been jealous of his own daughter's intelligence and success. She yelled that he had ruined their lives to satisfy his own fragile ego. They tore into each other with a brutal, relentless cruelty, stripping away every remaining ounce of their dignity. The few neighbors who had lingered at the edge of the property line stood in absolute silent shock. The wealthy socialites, the private school board members, and the elite country club members watched the reigning king and queen of their exclusive suburb scream obscenities at each other like feral animals. The illusion of their perfect marriage, their immense wealth, and their superior breeding was dead. They were just two desperate, venomous people turning on each other the second the ship began to sink. The screaming match raged until Richard finally ran out of breath. He stood there panting heavily, his chest heaving, his face covered in a sheen of cold sweat. He looked away from his furious, hateful wife and stared at his crying favorite daughter in the driveway. Then he looked at the massive moving trucks blocking the gates. He looked at the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminating the yard. He looked at the private security team standing guard over the front doors of the mansion he had falsely claimed as his own. The absolute inescapable reality of his situation finally settled over him like a heavy iron shroud. He was completely bankrupt. He was facing federal embezzlement charges. His wife despised him. His son-in-law had abandoned them to save himself, and he was being evicted into the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and a cheap motel key. Richard slowly turned his head. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I was standing next to Ethan on the edge of the lawn, perfectly calm, entirely untouched by the chaos destroying his life. I held all the cards. I legally owned the property. I controlled the holding company. I possessed the undeniable evidence of his massive fraud. The realization that I was the only person left in the entire world who could possibly save him washed over his face. The violent, entitled rage that had fueled him for decades vanished instantly, replaced by something far more pathetic. His broad shoulders slumped forward in defeat. His arrogant posture collapsed. He took a slow, shuffling step toward me and then another. He looked like a beaten, desperate man approaching his executioner. He raised his empty hands, his palms open in a gesture of complete, uncharacteristic submission. Richard took another shuffling step forward. The mud on his expensive leather shoes seemed to weigh him down, anchoring him to the reality of his total ruin. The aggressive flush that had colored his face during his screaming match with Patricia drained away completely, leaving him looking hollow, ashen, and suddenly very old. He stopped a few feet from me and Ethan, his hands still raised in that pathetic, submissive gesture. The man who had spent my entire life dictating my worth, controlling my finances, and demanding absolute obedience was now looking at me through the tear-filled eyes of a beggar. He did not look like a corporate titan anymore. He looked like a cornered thief who had finally run out of lies to tell. The silence on the lawn was absolute, broken only by the low mechanical hum of the 3 moving trucks and the crackle of the police radios. The private security team stood like statues by the front doors, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the scattered, crushed white roses beneath their boots. The police officers remained a few yards back, keeping a watchful eye, but allowing the civil matter to play out. They had seen the irrefutable proof of ownership. They knew who held the true power here tonight. Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing above the starched collar of his tuxedo. The sweat on his forehead caught the flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers, making him look feverish and ill. He looked at Ethan, assessing the solid, unyielding wall of my husband, and then his eyes flicked back to me. He realized that physical intimidation would only end with him in steel handcuffs. He had to pivot. He had to use the one vulnerability he believed I still possessed. He had to weaponize my lifelong desire for a family. Juliet, he began, his voice cracking with a forced, trembling vulnerability. He let his arms fall to his sides, adopting a posture of total surrender. Juliet, please listen to me. I know you are angry. I know things look incredibly bad right now. But we can fix this. We can sit down in the morning with the lawyers and sort everything out quietly. You do not have to do this tonight. You do not have to let these strangers take our home. I watched him perform. It was a fascinating display of narcissistic survival. He was actually trying to minimize the theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars into a simple misunderstanding that could be sorted out over morning coffee. He took another small, tentative step, reaching out as if to take my hand. Ethan shifted slightly, a silent, predatory warning that kept my father instantly at bay. Richard quickly pulled his hand back, clutching it to his chest, as if wounded by the rejection. We made mistakes. Juliet, Richard pleaded, tears actually spilling over his eyelashes and tracking through the dirt on his face. I admit it, I made terrible mistakes with the corporate accounts. The pressure of maintaining this lifestyle of keeping your mother and sister happy, it completely clouded my judgment. I lost my way. But we are blood. We are your family. Think about the good times we had when you were little. You were always my smart girl. You cannot put your own parents on the street like this. You are not that cruel. You have a good heart. Please, Juliet, give me a second chance to make this right. I did not blink. I did not soften. The little girl inside me who had once desperately craved his validation had died the moment I heard that voicemail recording. I looked at the tears streaming down his face and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no regret, no lingering sense of obligation. I stood perfectly still, letting the cool night air wash over me. My wedding dress, heavy with intricate lace, felt like armor. "I am not being cruel, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air with the precision of a scalpel. "I am simply executing a legal contract. The grace period expired at 3 o'clock today." His face twitched. He tried to speak again, opening his mouth to issue another string of pathetic apologies, but I cut him off sharply. "Do not dare stand there and try to weaponize the concept of family against me." I continued, taking a deliberate step closer to him. "You did not think about our blood when you forged my signature on those Vanguard holding documents. You did not think about my good heart when you siphoned my hard-earned money to pay for Savannah's sports cars and country club fees. You deliberately set up a shell company in my name to absorb all the debt, fully intending to leave me bankrupt and facing federal fraud charges while you escaped to an offshore account." Richard opened his mouth, gasping for air like a landed fish. "I did not mean for it to go that far," he whispered, lying until the bitter end. "You put yourselves on the street the moment you decided my wedding day was the perfect time to steal from me," I stated, my tone dropping into an icy, unyielding register. "You made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. My property belongs to me, and you have exactly 30 minutes left to vacate before those officers arrest you for trespassing." Behind Richard, Patricia slowly pushed herself up from the mud. Her $5,000 evening gown was completely ruined, the delicate silk stained with wet earth and grass. Her hair, previously styled into a flawless, intricate updo, was falling around her face in tangled, damp strands. She stumbled forward, pushing past my father, desperate to try her own hand at emotional manipulation. "Juliet, my sweet girl." Patricia wept, clasping her hands together in a pose of absolute prayerful desperation. "Please do not do this. You are upset. You have every right to be upset. But you are better than this public spectacle. Let us go inside. Let us talk about this like civilized people. We can be a family again. I will make sure your father repays every single cent. Just call off the security team." I looked at my mother. The woman who had spent my entire life treating me like an embarrassing stain on her perfect social record was now begging me for shelter. I remembered her voice on that voicemail, laughing with Savannah about my cheap little dinner and mocking the man I loved because he actually worked for a living. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute disgust in my tone made Patricia physically recoil. "Civilized people?" I repeated, echoing her words back to her. "That is an interesting choice of phrasing, Mother. Earlier tonight you told your wealthy friends that I was having a mental breakdown. On the phone yesterday you told Savannah that I was a useful idiot." Patricia shook her head frantically, fresh tears carving paths through her ruined makeup. "I did not mean it. I was just stressed. You know I love you. You said I was socially unfit for your world." I continued, holding her gaze until she was forced to look away in shame. "I heard the entire recording, Patricia. I know exactly how you view me. And you know what? You were right." Patricia looked up, a tiny, desperate flicker of hope sparking in her eyes, mistakenly believing I was finally agreeing with her assessment. "You were right," I repeated, letting a cold smile touch my lips. "I am completely unfit for your world. Because your world is built on fraud, deception, and parasitic greed. My world requires honesty and loyalty. You do not fit in mine. And as of today, you are no longer welcome in it." Patricia let out a shattered, breathless sob, burying her face in her muddy hands. She finally realized that the bridge was completely burned. There was no going back. Just as the silence settled over the lawn again, the heavy mahogany front doors of the estate swung open with a loud, violent bang. Savannah staggered out onto the marble porch. The two private security contractors walked closely behind her, their expressions bored and entirely unsympathetic. Savannah was no longer a vision of elite suburban perfection. She looked like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck. She was carrying two massive, cheap black plastic garbage bags. The thin plastic strained and stretched against the sharp edges of whatever basic necessities she had frantically managed to throw inside under the strict supervision of the guards. Her emerald gown was torn at the hem, and she had lost one of her designer high heels somewhere in the foyer. She limped down the marble steps, the heavy garbage bags dragging behind her, scraping against the stone. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her chest heaving as she fought for breath. She looked at Colin's tire tracks carved deep into the muddy driveway. She looked at our parents who were standing in the grass, completely broken and defeated. And then she looked directly at me. The sheer, unadulterated hatred in her eyes was toxic. It burned through the panic and the tears radiating a venomous, desperate fury. She dropped the heavy garbage bags onto the driveway. "You planned this," Savannah hissed, her voice a ragged, furious rasp that carried perfectly across the quiet lawn. "You knew about the accounts for months. You let us plan this party. You let us invite everyone we know. You sat there and watched us spend the money knowing you were going to do this. You have been waiting for this." I did not break eye contact. I looked at the sister who had bullied me, belittled me, and tried to steal my future so she could buy luxury handbags. I felt the immense, comforting warmth of Ethan standing right beside me, the family I had chosen, the loyalty I had finally found. "No," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute crystalline finality. "I was waiting for you to show up at my wedding. You made this choice." The lead police officer stepped forward, the heavy utility belt shifting against his uniform as he raised his hand. He announced in a loud, flat voice that the allotted grace period was officially over. There would be no more delays, no more negotiations, and absolutely no more packing. He gestured sharply toward the end of the long, winding driveway. Vance and his private security team moved in perfect synchronization. They formed a tight, intimidating semicircle around my family, effectively herding them away from the grand mahogany doors of the estate. The physical eviction had commenced. Richard did not utter a single word of protest. The arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life commanding boardrooms and terrorizing subordinates simply turned around and began to walk. His expensive leather shoes dragged heavily against the crushed gravel, ruining the pristine shine he always demanded. His shoulders were rounded, his chin tucked deep into his chest, looking every bit like a hollow shell stripped of its gold plating. He was marching toward a future of criminal indictments, endless court battles, and total bankruptcy, and the crushing realization had completely silenced his usual bluster. He walked like a condemned man heading to the gallows. Patricia, however, refused to surrender her delusions gracefully. She stumbled down the long driveway, her ruined designer gown tangling around her ankles and dragging through the mud. She swiped wildly at her tear-stained face, still trying to project an air of tragic, persecuted royalty. She looked frantically over her shoulder, desperately hoping to spot a sympathetic face among the catering staff or the few lingering neighbors who had not yet fled. She found absolutely no one. The people who had worshipped her social standing an hour ago now viewed her as a highly contagious disease. They watched her humiliating exit with cold, fascinated detachment, whispering behind their hands as the mighty matriarch was escorted off the premises like a common trespasser. Savannah was the last to move. She clutched the two cheap black garbage bags to her chest as if they contained the crown jewels. The thin plastic strained dangerously against the sharp corners of the few basic toiletries and cotton sweatpants she had been allowed to keep. She took a hurried step, and the bottom of the left bag scraped harshly against the driveway gravel. The plastic tore open with a loud rip. A generic plastic hairbrush, a simple white t-shirt, and a single tube of drugstore toothpaste spilled out onto the wet dirt. Savannah let out a choked, humiliated sob. She scrambled to her knees to shove the items back into the torn plastic, her hands shaking violently. A security contractor stepped close, crossing his massive arms over his chest, wordlessly urging her to keep moving. Savannah hugged the ripped bag tightly and scurried down the driveway, her bare foot slapping loudly against the cold stones where she had lost her designer heel. She did not look back at the mansion she had proudly claimed as her own. I walked several paces behind the security perimeter, moving slowly and deliberately. Ethan stayed right beside me, his presence a solid, unyielding fortress against the chaotic night. I wanted to witness this. I needed to see them cross the physical boundary of my property. I needed to watch the toxic infection that had plagued my entire life finally be excised. The procession reached the massive wrought iron gates. The security team stopped parting seamlessly to let the police officers guide my family through the stone archway and out onto the municipal concrete. They were officially off the property. They were standing under the flickering, harsh yellow glow of a public street lamp. The crisp dividing line between the stolen luxury of the estate and the unforgiving reality of the street was stark and absolute. The humid night air seemed to chill the moment they crossed the threshold. Savannah dropped her garbage bags onto the public sidewalk. She pulled her phone from her clutch, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped the device into the gutter. She swiped frantically at the screen, tapping the rideshare application. I watched from the shadows of the open gate as she ordered a premium luxury SUV. She stared at the screen, waiting for the confirmation wheel to stop spinning. Instead, a bright red error message flashed across her display. The corporate card linked to her account had been declined. Mr. Carmichael and his legal team had executed the asset freeze flawlessly. Every single account tied to Vanguard Holdings, every credit line Richard had fraudulently opened, and every corporate perk Savannah enjoyed had been simultaneously shut down. The money was completely gone. Savannah let out a frustrated, desperate shriek. She hastily typed in the numbers for her personal credit card, the one tied to her joint account with Colin. The screen buffered for an agonizing moment before flashing red a second time. Declined. Colin had not just physically abandoned her, he had systematically drained their joint liquid assets the moment he realized the police were involved. He had left her with absolutely nothing. No car, no home, and no access to cash. Savannah stared at her phone screen, her mouth opening and closing in pure silent shock. The golden child who had never once paid for her own lifestyle was now stranded on a public sidewalk in a torn dress, entirely incapable of summoning even a basic cab ride. Patricia watched Savannah's phone decline the transactions. The motherly facade she had worn to beg for mercy shattered completely. The realization that there was no hidden reserve, no backup plan, and no secret stash of cash finally registered. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She spun around, her eyes locking onto me where I stood just inside the property line. She marched right up to the edge of the wrought iron gates. She did not cross the threshold, deterred by the imposing stance of the security guards, but she leaned forward, her features contorted with a vicious, toxic rage. "You will regret this," Patricia screamed, the veins standing out sharply on her neck. Her voice was raw and hateful, echoing down the quiet suburban street and bouncing off the stone walls of the neighboring estates. "You are going to be completely alone. You are destroying your own blood. When you fall, and you will fall, there will be no one there to catch you. You will have absolutely no family." The air grew incredibly still. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers illuminated the deep lines of bitterness etched into my mother's face. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not feel a single drop of fear or regret. I felt Ethan's arm slide around my waist. He pulled me gently against his side, his thumb tracing a slow, reassuring circle against my hip. He did not say a word, allowing me to fight this final battle on my own terms, but his physical presence communicated a powerful, unwavering loyalty. I looked at Patricia, taking in the mud on her dress, the wildness in her eyes, and the absolute emptiness of her threats. "I already have a family," I said, my voice ringing out clear, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "One that actually shows up." Patricia opened her mouth to scream another insult, but I was already done. I turned my head slightly, catching the eye of Vance, the lead security contractor. I gave him a single sharp nod. Vance signaled his men. Two heavily muscled guards stepped forward and grabbed the thick iron bars of the massive estate gates. They pulled them inward. The heavy metal hinges groaned loudly in the night air, a deep, resonant sound that entirely drowned out whatever frantic curse Patricia was hurling at me. The two sides of the gate slammed together with a thunderous, echoing crash. Vance stepped forward and slid the heavy steel deadbolt into place, locking it with a sharp metallic crack. The physical barrier was finally closed. The emotional barrier was permanently sealed. I turned my back on the wrought iron gates. I did not look over my shoulder to see Savannah weeping on the sidewalk. I did not look back to see Richard staring blankly at the street lamp. I did not look back to see Patricia gripping the iron bars like a caged animal. I faced the long, beautifully manicured driveway leading back to the grand estate. Ethan kept his arm wrapped tightly around me as we walked away from the perimeter. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for my entire life suddenly vanished. The crushing anxiety of trying to please people who despised me, the constant fear of financial ruin, the endless toxic cycle of manipulation, it was all completely gone. It dissolved into the cool, humid air, leaving behind an incredible soaring sense of freedom. We bypassed the massive event tent where the catering staff were already quietly packing up the ruined remains of Savannah's fraudulent party. We walked directly to a sleek black luxury sedan, waiting quietly in the shadows near the garage. Ethan's private driver stood by the open rear door, offering a respectful nod as we approached. Ethan handed me into the back seat, sliding in right behind me and pulling the door shut. The interior of the car was warm, silent, and incredibly safe. I leaned my head against the soft leather headrest, letting out a long, shuddering breath. Ethan reached across the center console, taking my hand in his and bringing my knuckles to his lips. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked softly, his dark eyes searching my face in the dim light of the cabin. I looked out the tinted window at the sprawling, magnificent estate that now officially belonged to me. The property was secured, the thieves were exiled, and the battle was definitively won. I squeezed my husband's hand, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking across my face. "Take us to the airport," I told the driver. "We have a honeymoon to catch." The heavy engine purred to life. The black sedan glided smoothly down a secondary private access road, bypassing the front gates entirely. We drove away from the flashing police lights, away from the moving trucks, and away from the chaos of my former life. The estate faded into the darkness behind us, a closed chapter in a book I would never read again. The scene dissolved into the deep, quiet black of the night, the taillights of the sedan disappearing into the distance. The screen faded to absolute black, a silent, heavy pause hanging in the air, allowing the dust of the destruction to fully settle before transitioning to the brilliant, vibrant reality of the aftermath exactly 6 months later. The morning sun caught the edge of the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished concrete floor of my corner office. 6 months had passed since the heavy iron gates of the estate had slammed shut, locking my family out of my life forever. The transition had been nothing short of spectacular. Vanguard Holdings was no longer a host organism, being slowly drained of its lifeblood. Freed from the suffocating financial parasite that was Richard Wilson's endless embezzlement, the company had not just stabilized, it had exploded. We had doubled our profit margins, expanded into 3 new national markets, and acquired 2 of our largest competitors. I stood by the glass, looking down at the bustling city streets far below, holding a cup of steaming black coffee. The constant gnawing anxiety that used to sit in the pit of my stomach, the fear of unpredictable financial ruin, was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable power. A sharp, professional knock at the heavy glass door pulled me from my thoughts. Mr. Carmichael stepped into the office. He looked exactly as he always did, perfectly composed, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying his trademark blue-backed legal folders. He offered a polite, respectful smile as he took a seat at the circular glass conference table in the center of the room. I joined him, setting my coffee mug down on a cork coaster. "I have the final quarterly reports for Vanguard Holdings," Mr. Carmichael said, sliding the pristine documents across the glass. "And I also have the finalized court documentation regarding the civil restitution orders. I wanted to deliver these to you personally." I opened the folder. The numbers were staggering, but they were no longer a source of panic. They were a testament to accountability. I scanned the legal text detailing the asset seizures, the liquidated accounts, and the mandated garnishments. "The justice system has been remarkably efficient." Mr. Carmichael continued, his tone smooth and conversational, as if discussing the weather, rather than the total ruin of my former abusers. The judge did not look favorably upon the scale of the corporate fraud. The asset freeze remained absolute. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my legs. And the restitution, proceeding exactly as mandated, he replied, a faint, deeply satisfied gleam in his eye. Your father is currently having 70% of his wages garnished. Given his lack of employable skills outside of corporate theft, he has secured a position as a night shift security guard at a commercial warehouse facility on the edge of the industrial district. He works 12-hour shifts patrolling a chain-link fence. The uniform, I am told, is a rather unflattering shade of polyester brown. I let that image settle into my mind. Richard, the man who had demanded absolute submission, who had paraded around country clubs barking orders and drinking $1,000 scotch, was now walking a freezing asphalt perimeter in a cheap uniform, clocking in on a punch card just to pay back the daughter he had tried to destroy. It was a poetic, perfectly balanced scale of justice. And Colin, I asked smoothly. Mr. Carmichael adjusted his gold-framed glasses. Colin proved to be exactly the coward we expected. The moment he realized the forensic audit of Vanguard Holdings would inevitably expose the fraudulent seed money funding his own startup, he filed for divorce. He threw Savannah entirely under the bus, claiming he had absolutely no knowledge of her or her father's illegal activities. The federal investigators froze his assets anyway, but he legally severed all ties with your sister to protect his remaining reputation. The divorce was finalized last week. I looked down at the polished glass table. Savannah had worshipped the concept of a wealthy elite marriage. She had mocked my simple, authentic love because it lacked a massive price tag. Now her transactional marriage had evaporated the very second the money ran dry. She is currently residing in a very cramped, unrenovated studio apartment above a laundromat in the outer suburbs, Mr. Carmichael added, anticipating my next question. Because the court seized all stolen luxury goods, including her designer wardrobe and jewelry, she had nothing to pawn. She is presently working a minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing outlet in the local mall. She spends her days folding clearance sweaters and operating a cash register. I imagined Savannah, the girl who used to laugh at anyone wearing off-rack clothing, forced to stand behind a counter for 8 hours a day, ringing up the very people she used to despise. And Patricia? I asked, my voice completely steady. Mr. Carmichael closed his leather briefcase with a satisfying click. Your mother attempted to leverage her social connections to secure loans and temporary housing. It was a catastrophic failure. The moment the news of the embezzlement and the eviction broke among the elite circles, she was immediately and permanently exiled. The country club revoked her membership, citing the morality clause. Her socialite friends blocked her number. She is completely ostracized, living in the same tiny apartment with Savannah, entirely stripped of the only thing she ever truly valued. I nodded slowly, absorbing the absolute finality of it all. They had built their entire identities on a mountain of lies, and now they were buried underneath the rubble. I thanked Mr. Carmichael for his relentless dedication. He offered a respectful bow of his head, and quietly exited the office, leaving me alone in the quiet luxury of my success. A few minutes later, my cell phone buzzed against the glass surface of the table. The screen lit up, displaying an unknown local number. I stared at the glowing digits. I knew exactly who it was. Patricia had been using prepaid burner phones for the past 3 weeks, desperately trying to circumvent the legal blocks I had placed on all their known numbers. She would leave breathless, frantic voicemails, begging for cash, pleading for forgiveness, and attempting to drag me back into her web of toxic manipulation. In the past, a ringing phone would have triggered a massive spike of adrenaline. It would have sent my heart hammering against my ribs, filling me with a suffocating dread of whatever insult, demand, or crisis was waiting on the other end of the line. I would have felt the crushing, heavy obligation to answer, to fix, to placate. Now I looked at the glowing screen and felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left to burn. There was no sadness left to weigh me down. There was only a vast, empty ocean of pure indifference. They were strangers to me now. Their problems were not my problems. Their ruin was a consequence of their own design, entirely detached from my reality. I did not owe them my time, my money, or my emotional energy. I reached out with a steady hand and pressed the small button on the side of the device. The screen went black, instantly silencing the incoming call. The quiet of the office rushed back in peaceful and undisturbed. I slipped the phone into my pocket, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. The heavy glass door of my office swung open again, but this time there was no professional knock. Ethan strode into the room, bringing with him a rush of warm, grounded energy that instantly brightened the sterile corporate space. He was wearing a soft gray sweater and carrying a large brown paper bag that smelled intensely of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. He smiled a wide, genuine expression that made the corners of his eyes crinkle and set the bag down on my desk. He walked around the heavy oak furniture and pulled me out of my chair, wrapping his arms around my waist and pressing a firm, lingering kiss to my forehead. "I brought you lunch from that Italian place you love," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble against my ear. "The one with the amazing focaccia." I figured the CEO of Vanguard Holdings needed a break from reviewing spreadsheets. I leaned into his chest, closing my eyes and breathing in the familiar, safe scent of cedar and clean laundry. "Thank you," I murmured, wrapping my arms around his neck. "You have impeccable timing." We moved to the small sitting area in the corner of the office, unpacking the warm food and eating together in comfortable, easy silence. Ethan did not ask about the quarterly reports or the legal updates. He asked about my day, about a new design project I was excited about, and about our plans for the upcoming weekend. He looked at me with the exact same adoration and fierce loyalty he had shown on the day he married me, entirely unaffected by the wealth and power that now surrounded us. As I sat there sharing a simple meal with the man who had stood beside me like an immovable fortress through the darkest moments of my life, my mind drifted back to the image of my wedding day. I remembered standing at the front of that beautifully decorated hall, looking out at the rows of empty chairs. I remembered the initial agonizing sting of rejection, the sharp pain of realizing that my own blood relatives had deliberately chosen to abandon me on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. But looking back now from the vantage point of peace and absolute security, I realized the profound truth of that moment. The empty seats at my wedding had not been a tragedy. They had been the greatest, most merciful gift I had ever received. Those empty chairs had shown me exactly who did not belong in my life. They had exposed the toxic, parasitic nature of the people who had drained my spirit and stolen my resources under the guise of familial loyalty. By refusing to show up, my family had accidentally set me free. They had handed me the absolute clarity I needed to sever the ties without a single ounce of guilt. They had cleared the room, completely emptying my life of their constant, suffocating negativity, and in doing so, they had made all the room in the world for the people who truly mattered. They had made space for the friends who celebrated my authentic success. They had made space for the mentors who guided my professional growth. And most importantly, they had made space for Ethan, the man who had held my hand in the dark, who had fought my battles when I was too exhausted to stand, and who had loved me fiercely when I had nothing left to give. I looked across the small table at my husband. The midday sun poured through the high-rise windows, wrapping us both in a bright, warm glow. The city stretched out below us, vast and full of untethered possibility. The bitter, painful chapters of the past were completely closed, sealed away in legal documents and silent phone calls. I took a deep breath, tasting the fresh, clean air of a life built entirely on my own terms. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the victim. I was exactly where I was always meant to be. The story of Juliet and her family teaches us a profound lesson about the true meaning of loyalty, self-worth, and the courage required to walk away from toxicity. For years, Juliet endured the emotional abuse and financial parasitism of the people who were supposed to protect her. Society often dictates that blood is thicker than water, and that family ties must be preserved at all costs. However, Juliet's journey proves that sharing DNA does not give anyone a free pass to exploit, manipulate, or destroy you. True family is not defined by biological connections, but by mutual respect, unwavering support, and honest actions. When Juliet watched her parents and sister face the brutal reality of their own greed, she did not react with vengeance, but with a necessary clinical boundary. She realized that the empty seats at her wedding were not a symbol of her failure, but a merciful cleansing of her life. Sometimes the universe removes the people who are quietly draining your spirit to make room for those who will genuinely hold your hand in the dark. Protecting your peace often requires making agonizing decisions. It means looking at the people who raised you and accepting that their limitations are not your burden to carry. Juliet's ultimate triumph was not her immense wealth or her beautiful estate. Her true victory was achieving absolute indifference toward those who sought to ruin her, allowing her to build a future grounded in authentic love and undeniable truth. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with someone you love to protect your own peace? Share your story of resilience in the comments below, and please hit the like and subscribe buttons for more stories about reclaiming your power.